Imagine going from a brutal 78-hour workweek to a life of pure luxury, just eating, sleeping, and peak relaxation.
Yeah, boy.
But for our MC, the dream turned into a nightmare the second he realized where he was. When a maid mentions the return of his brothers, Leo and Tonio Palateo, the memories hit him like a truck. He's stuck inside Psychedelia, an ultra-hard RPG from his corporate days. But he didn't spawn as the hero. He's Alan Palateo, a low-tier side villain from a family of noble thugs. In the game's lore, the Palateo house is the first to be wiped off the map when the 5 Prime Sins awaken. Alan has exactly 10 years before his entire bloodline is annihilated. He sets a desperate goal to find these legendary sins while they're still kids and somehow reform them into peaceful nobles. However, he faces a massive wall. He's currently a side character with 0 special abilities. Let the countdown begin. 2 months had passed as Alan Palateo sat in his office receiving a debrief from his personal knight, leading to the knight explaining how he had successfully rescued the orphans from the human experiment lab out east and placed a girl named Utaya in charge of the new orphanage itself. In the treacherous world of Psychedelia, where betrayal is common, Evan stood out as an amazingly loyal supporting character who had been hired on the spot. He questioned Alan on whether the raid had been specifically for the purpose of rescuing Utaya. Evan gathered that there was something unique about the girl, having seen many things in his years as a mercenary, yet finding her unlike anything he had ever witnessed. He recalled finding her in the prison, and wondered why someone so incredibly powerful had chosen to remain confined, leading him to ask why Alan had not brought her to the estate. Alan knew this was a personal question, and while it might have looked like he was neglecting her, he recognized that leaving her untouched was a vital part of his plan. He grasped the danger of her lineage, as Utaya was a bloodborne, a race of people who contractually bind with mysterious beings of another realm in exchange for power. Our boy was well aware that she would later become the Sin of Wrath, a ruthless monster responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths, resulting in his hope that a peaceful upbringing would prevent her from becoming an apocalyptic monster. He deduced that he had finally cleared his first hurdle, though he simply told Evan that it was not the right time yet. This stern response hit Evan like a sting, causing him some discomfort as he processed the dismissal. Alan instructed him to ensure the secret remained safe while providing the orphanage with more than enough support, leading to Evan's quick compliance. Alan then produced an envelope, directing Evan to give it to Utaya. Alan mentioned it was just a greeting to check on her after the horrendous experiments she had endured. After taking the envelope, Evan departed to the orphanage on his horse. Watching from the window, Alan was unsure if soothing her was the right move, but reasoned it was worth the attempt. He had included a specific quote from the game, remembering how the Archbishop once said a strange quote that calmed Rutia in the game's records. He suspected this would have a soothing effect, recalling the scene of the Wrath arc where Utaya had laid waste to priests while in a monstrous state. In the game, she had screamed that it was too late before decimating everything around her, resulting in a chaotic battle. But since it was still 10 years before those events, Alan felt it might not be too late. He felt it was somewhat ridiculous that a simple quote could make them buddies with a monster, but he reasoned it might work since her race worshipped otherworldly beings. Meanwhile, Utaya read the letter as Evan watched her, sensing that the mana emanating from her was difficult to believe. He felt she was an eerie child with no emotion, causing a chill when she asked why Lord Alan had not yet summoned her to his side. Evan was unsure how to respond, knowing that only those at the master level should manifest mana in such a way, yet she was already emitting a strange amount. He remembered Alan's words about it not being the right time, leading him to repeat that exact phrase to her. Utaya smiled as she read the words Alan had written. Anguish of the shadow, clarity of the light, one word, one binding. She recognized this as a covenant only a true master would know. She mentioned that she understood his will, resulting in Evan grabbing his sword instinctively for protection. However, she simply accepted the message. Back in his room, Alan laid on his bed, feeling that nothing compared to a productive day to extend his lazy life, noting the brightly shining full moon as if it were cheering him up. The scene shifted to the library, where a sudden cascade of books tumbled onto Alan's head. He searched fruitlessly through the scattered volumes, deducing that information on the third boss was nowhere to be found. Sensing the commotion, Evan ran toward his young master, informing Alan that he had successfully rescued the second child as commanded. Alan looked up, a prominent bulge forming on his head, and asked if Evan had treated the boy with the utmost kindness. Evan confirmed that after saving the child from traffickers, he had followed those instructions to the letter. Suddenly, a heavy kick forced the library doors open as a man walked inside with an intimidating aura. It was Tonio Palateo, the second son of House Palateo. He approached and rested his elbow on Alan, remarking that seeing an illiterate loser rummaging through books was almost cute. Our boy remained silent, leading Tonio to pat his face ominously while demanding an answer from his little brother. Alan recognized that Tonio was a royal pain, wondering how the original Alan had ever endured such treatment. Though he felt a strong urge to strike back, he instead bowed his head to the ground, mentioning that since Tonio was there to use the study, he would take his leave. Tonio stepped firmly on his head, asserting that it was good Alan knew his place. In that moment, a dagger whistled through the air, narrowly missing Tonio's head before piercing the wall at the opposite end of the room. The first son, Leo Palateo, stood at the entrance, stating that a couple of pests causing a ruckus was incredibly annoying. Tonio screamed in shock as Leo explained he did not feel like drawing blood first thing in the morning, resulting in a demand for both of them to get lost. Alan, cowering on the ground while the two brothers faced off, felt a surge of annoyance. While Alan remained in a compromising position on the ground, he reflected on the immense influence of House Palateo. Although they were minor characters in the game, the reality was different. He knew one brother was the king of vice and baron of the underworld, while the other was a narcotics king operating a massive drug cartel. Alan understood that to live his dream, he could never get involved with these criminals. Later, in a different wing of the mansion, Alan lay exhausted on a couch while Evan remarked that the second child was also quite bizarre. Alan questioned the comment, causing Evan to wonder how his master knew about human experiments and trafficking in distant regions. He sensed that Alan looked as if he could barely keep himself alive, yet he was tracking down powerful children for an unknown purpose. Alan glared at Evan, deducing that bizarre was an understatement for the boy who had become an apocalyptic threat to the Carlian kingdom. The child he had rescued was Deus Macallion, the future sin of sloth. Alan remembered that Deus, sold into forced labor and abused as a child, would later decimate kingdoms in disturbingly violent ways. He recalled that players found his arc the most horrific, noting that while Deus was called Sloth, he was a tireless worker who repaid every grudge 100-fold. This was why our boy had advised Evan multiple times to be extra nice to him. Sipping his tea, Alan mentioned he had sent the boy to the orphanage because it was not the right time yet, a response Evan had begun to expect. The scene shifted to the orphanage, where children were playing, but Deus remained isolated. Utia walked up to him, stating bluntly that he was broken. She mentioned she knew who had given him those scars, identifying them as the work of the Shadow Goat. Utia smiled at Deus, informing him that he had been chosen by the Great Moon and should now unleash the power granted to him. She promised that as long as he followed him with unwavering loyalty, he would have his vengeance. As she spoke, she assisted Deus in releasing his energy, causing him to fathom his power as the sin of sloth. She then decided it was time to write her first reply to the simple greeting she had received from Alan. Back at the Palateo mansion, Alan was still in the library trying to read when the doors slammed open once more. Evan rushed in with urgent news, revealing that the jerk, Tonio, was dead. This was shocking to Alan, who realized that the douchebag had died in the streets with his body bloodied. At the funeral, the Count sat with two bored ladies who seemed more interested in leaving for a meal than honoring the dead. Alan noted the lack of respect, recognizing that while it was a dark fantasy, it was still messed up. He hadn't expected Tonio to kick the bucket so early or by accident, as it differed from the game where Leo had killed him after a pathetic struggle. Seeing Leo's sinister grin near the casket, Alan deduced that Leo or his camp was definitely responsible. Regardless, Alan understood he only needed to worry about the 5 prime sins. A year passed, and with the succession issue settled and Leo taking over the drug business, the matter found relative peace. Alan and Evan sat together exchanging information, having become pen pals with Utia. Alan was sure that building rapport like this would be vital, smiling as he read her letters. He noticed the orphanage's funding had grown significantly due to an increasing list of monthly patrons. The letters mentioned that Hidan was excellent at wargames, and Deus performed puppet shows. Evan then revealed that the Intelligence Guild had finally found a clue regarding an ancient tomb. Alan felt a surge of relief, believing he was finally closing in on the third boss. However, the scene cut to a drug distribution zone where blood splatters covered the floor. 2 of Leo's men were discussing their bright future. They arrived at an eerie sight when their hands suddenly began moving on their own. They watched in horror as their own daggers were pointed at their necks. They screamed for it to stop, but they had no control, resulting in them stabbing themselves to death. Deus stood nearby, clothed in a black robe and releasing ominous mana, revealing that he was the one controlling them like puppets. Utia jumped into the scene, praising the excellent puppet show and noting the list of patrons had grown. Deus asked if there was any meaning to these actions, wondering how unaliving filth helped with their revenge. Utia explained that it built a foundation for his glorious return, as they could not welcome him to a place so unworthy. Dias understood, leading them to dash out of the space instantly. Behind them, a massive mark of the blue moon was left on the ground where the men had fallen. This stood as the organization's bloody introduction to the underworld. 2 years had passed since Alan began his correspondence with Ukiah, and within the halls of the Palateo mansion, Evan hurried through the corridors in search of his master. Upon finding him, the knight fell heavily to the ground, mentioning that he had returned and had not realized Alan was out there. Evan informed him that he had safely moved the 5th child to the orphanage, leading Alan to be overcome with a brief moment of emotional relief as he recognized that he had finally finished rescuing the remaining 3 sins. Our boy, feeling a surge of gratitude, bent over and handed Evan several snacks, encouraging him to eat as much as he wanted, as he had used his knowledge of the game to overwork Evan just enough to find the sin of greed and the others. Later, while resting alone, Alan reasoned that everything was exceeding his expectations. He knew the bosses of psychedelia became the prime sins due to traumatic pasts, and although it was years before their transformation, he had been terrified of rescuing them too late in a broken state. He had succeeded in gathering them while they were still young, leading him to ask Evan for an update on the orphanage. Evan handed over a letter, noting that things were going great and that the children, who once seemed like broken shells, had brightened up significantly. Alan deduced that he might not even need to assign additional caregivers, marveling at how well Ukiah was leading them. He wondered if her character's inherent attachment to the orphanage made her protective, sensing she might not even want him to intervene. He mentioned to Evan that Ukiah was a decent kid, causing the knight to stand and ask if there were any specific tidbits in the letter. The message stated that everyone was in good health, specifically noting that Dias was doing so well that concern was no longer necessary. Alan felt a wave of happiness, seeing the 5 prime sins growing up like normal kids, concluding that the surrounding environment truly mattered. Evan then questioned when Alan actually planned to meet the children, but Alan recognized that he never intended to meet them in person. Although he gathered it would be helpful to be on friendly terms, he remembered their terrifying temperaments from the game and remained frightened of them. He told Evan the right time might be in 5 years, causing Evan to simply accept the delay. Alan quickly changed the subject, focusing on developing enough magic skill to keep himself safe in this dark fantasy world. During their training, Evan asked if Alan had heard of Blue Moon, a group that had recently become famous for hunting criminal organizations. Alan dismissed them as a charitable group cleaning up trash, deducing that since they weren't in the game, they were likely a minor gang that would soon disappear. However, Evan noted that they had begun targeting and ending nobles as well, which caused Alan to stop his magic practice instantly. Scared for his life, our boy ordered Evan to sleep in the chambers next to his starting that day. Inside the orphanage, the atmosphere was far more intense as Ukiah began a weekly briefing with the other sins. Solon, the sin of sloth, landing from a graceful twirl, reported that she had plucked the heads off human traffickers in the north. She mentioned her fondness for the robe Renee had made. Renee, the sin of greed, then explained that she had dissolved all the corpses without a trace. Radon, the sin of obsession, sat nearby and mentioned he had made mincemeat of those at the human experimentation lab and the Avalon insects until nothing remained. Ukiah praised their work, declaring that everything would come to pass as the great moon willed it. The secret organization Blue Moon was, in fact, the group of children Alan was harboring. However, Dias informed Ukiah of a problem. While cleaning up the south, he found a note suggesting the head of Avalon was targeting the great moon. This revelation caused Ukiah to exude a terrifying energy, her anger causing the air to grow heavy as she squeezed a paper detailing a plot to poison the 3rd son once the Count died. 2 years later, Count Palateo passed away. Standing before the casket, Alan reasoned that while the official cause was a heart attack, the Count's drug habits made the death unsurprising. Nearby, Alan's brother was enraged, receiving a report that Blue Moon had launched a surprise raid that left everyone dead. Alan realized his brother was more worried about this gang than the funeral itself. When the silent, tearless service ended, Alan instructed Evan to start packing, planning to head south to the small town of Rodmill. Leo glared at their departing carriage with deep discomfort. But strangely, only 3 days after their departure, Alan found himself back at the manor for another funeral, this time for Leo. Alan was baffled, knowing this death was entirely different from the game, especially since Leo had been killed by direct stab wounds to the heart. He asked a servant about the cause of death, but the man was so terrified he apologized, just for making eye contact. As Alan wondered what had gotten into everyone, Evan whispered a shocking question, asking if Alan was the mastermind who had wiped out Avalon overnight. Alan looked around at the sweating, fidgeting staff. He realized absurd rumors were spreading, despite his complete lack of involvement. A few days ago, on the day Alan departed for Rodmill, Evan spoke to him, questioning whether it might be better to relocate to a larger city instead. Alan paused for a moment, deducing that such a move would be a mistake, as Rodmill was the final destination of his master plan. He had already taken the necessary measures by saving the 5 prime sins from their misfortunes, ensuring they were now living peaceful lives. Since Rodmill had nothing to do with the game's original plot and housed the Palateo family's villa, our boy realized it was the perfect place to enjoy the rest of his life as a noble in total bliss. He responded by claiming there was a reason for everything, a statement so bland that Evan mentioned he could no longer be fooled by such vague explanations. Alan insisted it was the right choice and told Evan to trust him, recognizing that the night was becoming more intuitive, which made Alan feel slightly uncomfortable. As the carriage began to roll away, Leo Palateo watched from a distance, debating whether or not he should kill his brother. He reasoned that it made little difference, though he had considered poisoning Alan after their father's death. However, since Alan had volunteered to move away, Leo sensed he no longer had a reason to eliminate him. He gathered that perhaps his annoyance stemmed from Avalon's dealings not working out lately, yet Alan's presence still bothered him. Leo called out to his lackey, Alman, and commanded him to trail the carriage. Alman stood behind him and asked if that was an order to kill, causing Leo to turn in surprise, as Alman had never questioned a command before. Leo frowned, noticing Alman holding his sword, and began to state that Alman's job was simply to carry out orders. He was cut short as Alman suddenly drove his blade straight into Leo's chest. Leo gasped in shock at the betrayal, while Alman mentioned how much he enjoyed war games. In that moment, it became clear that Alman was actually Hidden, the hidden member of the Blue Moon. He explained that the Crimson Moon had given them a creed to follow, as Blue Moon was the sword of the Great Moon and acted only in accordance with his will. Hidden declared that if anyone tried to harm the Great Moon, they were permitted to act on their own accord. He had killed Leo specifically to protect Alan. As Leo fell to the ground, Hidden noted that he had been waiting 2 years for Leo to utter such a threat. Leo screamed that his subordinates would kill Hidden, but Hidden simply informed him that his own words had put into motion the complete annihilation of Avalon. He remarked that it was a shame, as the Great Moon had given Leo a chance, before dashing off and leaving Leo's lifeless body behind. The scene shifted to Alan waking up in Rodmill, feeling as though he had found heaven on earth. He enjoyed the freedom of waking and eating whenever he pleased, finally embracing the spoiled life of a noble. The meal was so delicious he even considered starting a toast shop, but the peace was shattered when Evan arrived with a letter. Alan dropped his food in shock as he read the message requesting his swift return following the death of Leo Palateo. He recognized that his trial period for heaven had ended in only 3 days. Returning to the Palateo Manor for the funeral, Alan noticed that everyone around him was trembling at his presence. Evan whispered a question, asking if Alan was the mastermind who had wiped out Avalon overnight. Alan struggled to process the ridiculous situation. He moved to a corner in despair and asked Evan to explain how he had become a dark mastermind in simple terms. Evan reasoned that Alan was the only one who benefited from the situation, and since Leo was killed after they left, Alan had the perfect alibi to secure his place as the heir. Alan felt shriveled as Evan added that since Avalon was gone, Leo's death wouldn't bring any lingering trouble, cementing Alan's reputation as a sinister mastermind with a swordmaster and assassin at his command. It made no sense to Alan. He was sure no organization was powerful enough to wipe out a syndicate like Avalon overnight. When he asked about Blue Moon, Evan shook his head, explaining that the Intelligence Guild found it unlikely since Blue Moon never left bodies, only a mark on the ground. Avalon, however, had been cut down by a sword in a display of total carnage. These words filled Alan with fear, causing him to sigh as he accepted that he was now viewed as a scary mastermind. He reasoned that since Blue Moon wasn't in the game, they weren't strong enough to be the culprits. Meanwhile, back at the orphanage, Utias stood before the other sins, asking if they had left any traces. Renee and Solon confirmed they had left none, with Solon laughing about the mountain of bodies they had created. The door creaked open as Deus walked in, swords floating around him, reporting that he had cut down the remaining 486 members of Avalon. Radon added that they had cut them all in half, according to instructions. Utia was pleased, noting that Avalon, the empire that once ruled the Asteria Kingdom, was reduced to nothing in 5 days. However, Radon pulled out a file, mentioning that their job wasn't over because certain nobles, including those from House Althea, were deeply involved with Avalon. Utia looked at the file and told them they already knew what she was about to say, leading everyone to resonate with her unspoken command. Radon confirmed they would take care of it quietly, Our boy's influence was growing far beyond his control. What happens when Alan realizes his peaceful protégés are dismantling the kingdom's nobility in his name? Uttaya calmed herself, ensuring she maintained control before addressing Renee to ask if they were officially in the clear with the Intelligence Guild. Renee presented a piece of paper, noting that the guild considered the recent incident to be entirely unrelated to Blue Moon. Diaz added that all the guilds were in agreement, having concluded that the event was a total carnage brought on by a lone swordmaster, prompting Uttaya to smile while insisting that this incident must never reach the Great Moon. She mentioned that she had said it plenty of times and was sure they were well aware of the stakes. Diaz pointed out that Alan's own family had targeted his life, which was the sole reason they had intervened. Uttaya reminded them that they had performed actions that were never ordered, noting that they were but a mere sword of his. She reasoned that a sword should not think for itself, leading to her command that Blue Moon must only take action when a direct order is given. She warned them to remember this well, since the Great Moon knows everything, resulting in Diaz feeling a bit uncomfortable. He gathered that he didn't quite understand why someone as powerful as Uttaya was shaking nervously at the mere thought of being caught by their leader, yet he complied by stating he understood. Uttaya concluded the briefing by affirming that everything they did was for their master, the Great Moon. The scene shifted to Alan's office, where our boy looked up with exhaustion and watery eyes, wishing he had a moment to catch his breath. For a whole month following the funeral, he had been so busy that he barely had time to rest. He recognized that while he hated Leo, his brother was supposed to die 6 years later, not now. Because of that unexpected death, Alan had become the heir and was now forced to handle a massive pile of estate affairs. When more people walked in carrying books and tasks, Alan felt a wave of annoyance, wondering why everyone was suddenly so uptight about work. He noted that they never failed to slack off when the old man was alive, leading him to flick them away so they would leave his office. The workers retreated, fearing his anger and thinking they needed to work even harder to avoid dying there. Alan, on the other hand, deduced that they were only taking their work seriously because of the rumors painting him as a ruthless mastermind. Later, the scene moved to an open fire. Evan watched Alan use magic, mentioning that he was truly stunned that a self-taught student could reach the second tier in only 2 years. Evan noted that most people took 4 years of proper training under a teacher to reach that level, resulting in Alan admitting he had a decent amount of talent. Alan knew he had practiced magic non-stop for self-defense because he felt so uneasy, realizing that even basic techniques demanded precise control. He recalled the novelty of casting spells in a fantasy world, yet he came to a terrible realization that his mana core was comically tiny. He felt distraught, knowing that a mana core was something a person is born with, similar to an athlete's physique, and his was minuscule. He understood that no amount of training could fix it, though he reasoned there might be a way around it if all else failed. Evan then brought out a letter, mentioning that Alan had finally received an invitation to the seasonal ball. At the ball, Alan and Evan walked through a large room filled with nobles. Alan sensed he was already tired, but he knew that as a future count, he needed to use this opportunity to secure a peaceful future and make some friends. However, he gathered that everyone feared him. When he tried to wave at fellow nobles, they flinched and ran away because of the dark rumors surrounding his name. Evan tapped him on the shoulder and laughed, telling him not to take it personally. Alan lied to himself, pretending he wasn't upset as he moved to find a drink. He recognized that while the Palateo family were once respected, they were now known as the Rogues of the East. Our boy decided to break the prejudice with his secretly perfected social skills. He walked up to a lady and mentioned that the wine had an intriguing flavor and a captivating aroma. While he intended to be charming, his expression was gloomy and detached, causing him to glare at her while saying it would be delightful to stock several bottles in his manor. He finished with what he believed was a charming smile, but it looked far from it. The lady became hostile and ran off screaming that she would tell her father to prepare the wine immediately, viewing his request as a threat. Alan was confused as people began whispering that he had coerced her into handing over limited edition bottles. Later that evening, Evan listed the spoils of victory they had acquired: a luxury steed from the Faldians, tea from the Finas, a handkerchief from House Velandes, and Melantino's original wine. Evan was impressed, but Alan remained gloomy, having studied wine just to have everyone run away. He realized the Palateo name was more notorious than he had imagined, and he went outside to get some fresh air. But in that moment, a very beautiful lady with red hair watched him walk away. When Alan arrived at the veranda, he began to wonder where everything went wrong. A beautiful voice called out to him. Alan was surprised to be approached first. He turned around to find the space empty until he looked down and saw a young girl. She introduced herself as Loria Altia, the third daughter of Duke Altia. Alan recognized the name immediately, knowing the Altia family were the rogues of the north and one of the 3 dark masterminds of psychedelia. He reasoned that no one who approached him first would be normal. Loria spoke plainly, asking for his strength because she was about to be assassinated. Alan stood dazed after hearing Loria Altia's plea, finding himself momentarily speechless. He recognized that although she was protected as the daughter of the Duke's mistress, her life would be forfeit the moment the dying Duke passed away, leading Alan to realize why he had never encountered her in the game. She was already dead by this point in the original timeline. She suggested that with the power he possessed, he might be able to save her, but our boy maintained absolute composure. He respectfully refused the request. Loria was confused, mentioning that she was not asking for aid without offering compensation. As Alan turned to walk away, she called out, promising that half of the Altia estate would be his if he helped. Alan continued his departure, reasoning that he was barely getting by himself and should not give her false hope. He gathered that it sucked for her, but, contrary to the circulating rumors, he was currently powerless. He glanced back at her looking pitiful in her shame, causing him to exhale and stretch his neck. He turned one last time to tell her that good things would come her way, sincerely hoping she would find someone who could help, before he walked back into the ball. Nearby, a member of the Blue Moon noted that an Altia had approached the Great Moon. They mentioned the need to inform the Crimson Moon that he had foretold good fortune for her. However, Renee reasoned that such a report was unnecessary. She gathered that, based on their intel, Loria was the only Altia not involved with Avalon, and was therefore not one of Radon's targets. Diaz noted that this made things easier, since the rest of the Altias would be eradicated anyway. Renee instructed them to remain focused on keeping the Avalon incident concealed from the Great Moon. Alan continued through the ball in a daze, noticing that everyone was still avoiding him like the plague. Suddenly, a voice from the corner offered a greeting. He wondered if he was finally getting a chance to mingle, but as he turned, he saw a lady beaming with beauty. He recognized her from the game as another mastermind of the shadows, causing him to realize that no one in their right mind would talk to him first. He approached her, offering greetings to Lady Kalia. Kalia Janania, the first daughter of Count Janania, was surprised he knew her name. Alan mentioned she was famous, reasoning that there were 3 masterminds in Asteria, Altia of the North, Palateo of the East, and the Janania family, the Rogues of the West. He knew that while the Palateos were like thugs, the Jananias were more like the organized mafia. Alan realized that if he wanted a life of bliss, he could not afford to get involved with an evil mastermind. He bowed, claiming that words of her beauty had traveled far, causing her to smile. She said that she would love to extend this conversation of theirs, asking what Alan thought of that suggestion, leading Alan to remark that while he didn't mind, there were too many watchful eyes around. Inwardly, he pleaded to be let go. Kalia smirked, noting the rumors were true, and hoped they would meet again soon. As she walked away, Renee and Diaz watched from the corner. Renee mentioned the Avalon incident was well contained, but Diaz pointed out they had one more worry. That thing had been watching the Great Moon. Sensing a threat, the Sins dashed toward the shadow, deciding to keep an eye out and dispose of the Watcher if necessary. The following day, Alan and Evan stood before a massive cliff. Evan questioned if this dark gorge was truly the place Alan had been searching for. Alan was determined, recognizing the field effect of his true objective. He guaranteed it was the real thing, remembering how easily he had found the Labyrinth of Whispers in the game. He had traveled all this way to obtain a rare artifact by solving the riddles within. As they reached the massive door, Alan was astonished by its scale. Evan had asked Alan how did he even know about the sort of place, but Alan accidentally responded, saying that he came here a lot. He laughed it off as a joke, but Evan looked at Alan's scary face and asked him not to make such jokes. They entered the space, encountering shrieking creatures and giants. Evan noted that the labyrinth seemed ready to pounce if they made a mistake. They needed to solve a riddle to escape this place. As they moved through the maze, Evan reflected on his 4 years with Alan, realizing he still didn't understand his master. He reasoned that none of the previous missions, eliminating syndicates, paying debts, or saving kids, seemed related. He wondered how Alan knew every inch of the maze while only ever staying at the manor. Evan decided that since all of Alan's previous enigmatic actions had turned out for the better, he would continue to serve him. Alan felt as if he might puke as they reached the final chamber. They arrived at a massive room filled with gold, but Alan ignored the wealth, instructing Evan to take only a specific black ring. Evan grabbed some gold bars, but Alan warned him to put them down, knowing they would only bring misfortune. He was happy to have obtained the constraint. As they exited, they were confronted by a pile of rocks that Alan recognized as golems. Evan, sensing the danger, tried to find a way to get Alan to safety, but our boy walked past him and announced he would take this fight. Evan was confused, warning that second-tier spells weren't strong enough, but Alan stood strong. He began to chant, causing the ring to glow with ominous energy that froze the golems instantly. Alan suddenly found himself in a different space, where a voice spoke of carrying on the Great Will. He recognized the constraints offered as rewards for clearing the labyrinth. He understood the ring was a consumable artifact that exchanged restrictions for boosts. When the voice asked him to speak, he requested the absolute use of Bavaloya's hand seals, and the limited use of Bavaloya's utterances. The voice approved, puzzled by his specific choices, but Alan reasoned that since he knew all the seals and utterances from playing the game, this would give him the greatest boost. The ring was absorbed into his hand, and Alan returned to the gorge. And in that moment, Evan called out to him to be careful. Alan noted his lightning magic was faint due to his tiny mana core, but he realized it was time to put the constraints to the test. He pointed his hand at the golems. They were not ready for what was coming next. The first word Alan uttered was bend, and as the command left his lips, lightning crackles began to erupt around him with violent intensity. He followed immediately with his second word, rebound, causing the lightning to vibrate throughout the entire space, filling the cavern with a blinding flash. And upon speaking the third word, cobalt luster, it resulted in lightning coalescing into a massive, levitating orb of electrical energy that hovered ominously before the monsters. Finally, diffraction pierce, while simultaneously forming 3 intricate hand seals. With a sharp flick of his wrist, he sent the lightning surging through the space. The attack struck the golems with such precision and force that they were completely unable to react, causing their massive forms to lose the ability to move instantly. Within less than a minute, their structures began to scatter and disfigure, resulting in the once mighty guardians becoming nothing more than ordinary rocks on the ground. Evan stood frozen in shock, mentioning that the display was nuts, while Alan maintained absolute composure. As they ventured deeper into the space, Evan questioned if Alan had been hiding his true powers all along. He mentioned that in his 15 years of mercenary work, he had never seen anything like it, expressing disbelief that such a feat was the result of second-tier magic. Alan insisted that it was indeed second-tier magic, but inwardly, even our boy was flabbergasted. He realized that the spell was far more powerful than it had ever been in the game. He calculated that by using 4 utterances and hand seals, he had effectively burst chain lightning for what was equivalent to 5 turns in the original RPG mechanics. He reasoned that the constraints he had accepted probably doubled the spell's power, resulting in an overkill effect he had not anticipated. After a long trek up the stairs, they finally reached the exit of the tunnel. Both men were exhausted, leading Evan to sit down and remark that the climb was more tiresome than the actual battle. Alan reflected on the layout of the place, remembering from community forums and walkthroughs that the Labyrinth of Whispers was also known as Fallon's Labyrinth. When he mentioned that a person named Fallon had built it, Evan asked for clarification, but Alan simply shook him off and suggested they head back. He praised Evan for keeping up so well over the last 3 weeks. Though the knight was already so tired, he wondered what was driving his master to keep moving despite his appearance. As Alan dragged Evan along, he pondered. Alan understood that while a compatible hand seal granted a power boost, the right utterance enhanced the skill's properties. He recognized that while the game only showed rising numbers, the reality here involved visible, physical changes to the magic itself. He deduced that his talent for mana control allowed him to notice these subtle shifts despite his tiny mana core, deciding he would test the limits again once his mana was replenished. Unbeknownst to them, Renee was watching every movement from the treetops. Once she was sure Alan was safe, she dashed to the entrance of the cave and began reading the ancient writings on the walls. She touched the inscriptions, which detailed a forgotten era and a radiant emperor known as the Great Forlorn who had defeated monsters that consumed human hearts. Renee realized she only knew these secrets because of her gift, the Archive of Antiquity. She recalled Alan mentioning the name Fallon and realized there was far more to him than she had gathered. She reasoned that if a figure like Queen Blooddeer served him, he was already unfathomable. But the idea that he was an esteemed friend of the Great Forlorn himself was beyond her imagination. Renee felt a deep sense of shame for having followed others so blindly, blushing as if she had witnessed a higher power. Hearing a rustle, she turned to find Diaz standing atop a tree. He mentioned that the man in black had already died, noting that his head had been twisted twice in midair. Renee decided she should report the situation before the cleanup, and the two sins darted away. Meanwhile, at the Genonia Manor, Kalia reflected on her encounter with Alan. She sensed that his eyes held the chilling emptiness of a boundless abyss, finding it fascinating that he had specifically called her famous, despite her lack of socialization with other nobles. She sat in her father's office, speaking to Count Genonia, as if he were still himself. However, she whipped her finger and released a strange energy, causing the Count to fall dazed against his table. She smiled, knowing that no one should find out she was acting as the head of the family by turning her father into a mindless puppet. Kalia wondered how Alan had found out her secret. She realized that the shadow she had put on him to tail his movements had been compromised, deducing that Alan was fully aware of her surveillance. A servant rushed into the office, screaming for her to come to her chambers. There, she found the body of the man she had sent to follow Alan. Her guard mentioned that the man's seal hadn't been activated, meaning no secrets were exposed before he died. Kalia didn't react with anger. Instead, she smiled, recognizing that Alan had placed the body in her chamber on purpose. She felt a mix of annoyance and intrigue, realizing that even though they had barely met, he already had her by the throat from a distance. The scene shifted to the Altea estate, where Loria sat in heavy silence, reflecting on her encounter with Alan. She recognized that he was no ordinary man, possessing the same cold eyes as her father. She gathered that she must never cross him, though she felt the sting of despair, knowing he was her last hope. She reasoned that he had naturally refused to engage with her because she had much to lose, especially since her cowardly siblings had stripped her of all assets and power. She stood outside her building, having desperately survived by making the best of her father's lingering affection. But she now wondered what was left for her to do. Suddenly, a frantic maid called out, screaming that the third lady had returned and that Pyrene and Lord Keg had taken their own lives. Loria was shocked and confused, finding it impossible to believe that people so cruel and prone to backstabbing would suddenly end themselves. When she asked about Tima Lian and Mary Lian, a loud scream echoed through the manor. Outside the door, witnesses discovered that the other two siblings had used swords to stab themselves in the chest. In the midst of the frantic chaos, Radon dashed away from the space, smiling because the mission was completed before flying out of the mansion. As the maids ran in terror, Loria stood paralyzed, remembering Alan's parting words. Good things would come her way. She realized that Alan Palateo, the true mastermind of the family, had kept his talents hidden until the perfect moment to rise to power. She concluded that he had been referring to this very moment, as she had become the only remaining heir to the Duke overnight. She felt as though she had made a deal with the devil, yet she knew it was too late to turn back. Remembering the examples of those who had betrayed him, she steadied her resolve, choosing to move forward with the path she had taken. 2 months later, inside the Palateo mansion, a butler presented a box to Alan, explaining it was a gift from Duchess Altea. Evan exclaimed in surprise, recognizing a bottle of Carnan's wine. He noted it was antique and worth a few thousand gold, hardly able to believe he was seeing it in the flesh. Alan found a letter signed respectfully by Loria Altea, causing him to realize that the feeble sheep among wolves had actually become the Duchess. He felt a lingering sense of guilt, wondering why she would send such a gift after he had refused to help her. The messenger confirmed that the Duchess had prepared the gift herself and commanded it be delivered to Alan in person. In the Altea office, Loria stretched after a long day of work, reflecting on how quickly the 2 months had passed since her father's death. She had officially become the Duchess and now occupied the very office she was once forbidden to enter. She realized that because she had been at the ball, she had a perfect alibi and was able to avoid all suspicion regarding her siblings' deaths. She also gathered that by the time she had returned to the estate, her siblings had already eliminated her secret organization, leaving her powerless until Alan intervened. She felt a drop of sweat down her brow, wondering how many moves Alan saw ahead. She was sure he had orchestrated everything in her favor, even though he had turned her down with nonchalance. She reasoned he must need the Alteas for something, likely their renown, and ability to steer the kingdom's politics from the shadows. Looking at her father's portrait, she decided to focus on her duties, knowing her patron would reach out soon. Back in his office, Alan watched the messenger leave, still bewildered by how Loria had survived to become Duchess. 5 years passed, bringing the story to the winter before the game's main events were set to begin. Evan addressed Alan as Your Grace, noting that since he was now the Count, the title was officially his even without a formal ceremony. Alan realized that while becoming a Count wasn't part of his chill life plan, he had grown used to maximizing the perks of nobility. His work-life balance was better than expected. Evan handed him an envelope from Utaya, though he still had no lead on Leo's killer. Evan asked if he sought revenge, but Alan simply responded that he wanted to be prepared for anything. secretly recognizing the deviation from the game as a butterfly effect of his own making. Alan turned his attention to a letter from Utaya. The monthly updates from the orphanage always warmed his heart, as she described how the children were thriving. She mentioned that they were absorbed in hobbies. Solon was enjoying games with friends, Renee was poring over books and making crafts, and Radon had taken up gardening. Alan felt a surge of pride as their patron, wondering if this was what it felt like to be a father. He asked Evan about the children's ages, and Evan noted they were nearly old enough to head out into society. Alan decided it was time to let them move on, reasoning that since they were now healthy young adults, he should consider their bright futures. He calculated that he had taken good care of them specifically to prevent them from becoming doomsday monsters. He reflected on their gifts of fate. Alan poured forth the papers he had, so that he could write letters to each of the children, realizing that if he assigned them to posts where these gifts could shine, they would lead successful lives. Excited by the plan, Alan shouted with joy, startling Evan awake from a slumber. Alan handed over letters for the orphans, telling them to go forth and spread their wings in the vastness of the world. He hoped that one day he might receive nice gifts from them in return. When the letters reached the group, Utaya announced that their instructions had arrived. The others were excited by the individual letters, but Utaya's expression remained somber as she looked at the contents. The great moon was setting them free. What will the five sins do now that their master has ordered them to leave his protection and enter society? Uthia addressed the gathered group, insisting they read his previous letters first, since his instructions were often cryptic. Solon questioned if they were permitted to do so, noting that until now, only Uthia had been allowed to read them. Uthia reasoned that because Alan had sent individual instructions, he had determined they were all finally ready. As they flipped through the pages, they found messages asking how they were, and mentioning that they seemed to have many talented friends. The notes were warm, causing the group to wonder if these were actually instructions. Uthia clarified that the messages only appeared simple because the true meaning was hidden beneath the surface. She presented the first set of instructions she received after their initial greetings, which mentioned his second brother exchanging letters. From this, she deduced that he had specified a target for elimination and ordered a report afterward. She showed another where he entrusted the blue moon to her, pointing out that he had personally chosen every one of them. The group gathered that the cryptic nature was a measure to prevent secrets from leaking. Uthia confirmed this, noting they had to decode everything before starting a mission. Radon asked why they didn't just visit him or use a communication orb, but Uthia reminded them that as his followers, they only needed to obey. This faithful devotion struck Deus as almost chilling. Solon suggested they read their new letters, leading to a wave of dramatic realizations. Deus revealed he was ordered to journey to Caliburn, the nation of knights. Solon complained about her destination being Colony, as she had no desire to visit the desert. Radon shared he was headed to Rakshat, the city of entertainment, while Renee mentioned her destination was Larthania. Uthia, smiling, noted she had been called to the Holy Kingdom of Rosario. Deus recognized that for some unknown reason, our boy had ordered him to become a knight. Solon added that the letters promised more than enough support, and Renee mentioned he had even written about where she could find a present. Radon reasoned they would find out his true intentions once they arrived. Uthia gave a final warning. Unless he spoke of it first, they were strictly forbidden from mentioning the blue moon to anyone. The scene shifted to the beginning of their journey out of the orphanage. It felt eerie, marking the start of their new lives. 3 months later, Alan sat in his office, still buried in books and estate matters. He complained that he still couldn't find information on utterances and magic effects. He asked Evan for news on Leo's assassins, but Evan noted the Intelligence Guild had made no progress. Alan gathered that the butterfly effect was spinning out of control, simply because he had rescued the 5 prime sins. Even Loria, who was meant to die early, was now a duchess expanding her influence. Alan instructed Evan to stop looking for the assassins, reasoning that not knowing was a blessing. He deduced that since nothing usually escapes the Intelligence Guild, there was no point in digging for people who knew how to stay off the radar. He calculated that as long as he stayed out of their way, secret groups had no reason to harm him. Evan agreed to suspend the investigation and mentioned that Deus had been knighted in Caliburn. Alan found the news pleasant. 3 months later, while Evan was holding a surprising amount of snacks, he reported that Deus had formed his own order of knighthood. Yet he recognized that Deus reaching such a level so quickly was a feat of absolute composure. Evan mentioned rumors that Deus might be appointed as a Master Knight, one of the swords of Caliburn, within 10 years. Alan was amazed by the natural talent. A year after the Prime Sins had departed, Evan rushed in with shocking news. Deus had already been promoted to one of the 5 swords of Caliburn. Alan was flabbergasted, knowing that only swordmasters with the derivation ability usually held that title. Evan clarified that while Diaz hadn't reached derivation yet, he had defeated the fourth sword in a duel and filled a vacancy left by the northern barbarians. Alan reasoned that while the youngest master knight in history, Reinhardt, reached that level at 32, Diaz had done it in just a year, despite starting with no knowledge of swordsmanship. He wondered if he might get a thank you benefit for this success, though he felt a bit hurt that only Euthea sent him regular letters. He snapped out of it, deciding he should just be grateful they hadn't become monsters. Evan patted him on the shoulder to comfort him. The scene shifted to the capital of Caliburn, at the grand mansion of the Order of the Solar Eclipse. Diaz stood before a window in his grand knightly attire. He looked down to see his sister waving at him and smiled back. He reflected on the year that had passed, feeling ashamed of the hatred he once held, after losing everything to the dark. He remembered how his rescue by the Great Moon and the promise of revenge had led him to conform to the Blue Moon's rules, completing dangerous missions to build a foundation for vengeance. He recalled receiving his first set of instructions, which mentioned a present awaiting him at a small inn called Legant 10. At the time, he couldn't have cared less about a meaningless gift, but he went anyway. Upon entering, he found that the present Alan had prepared was his lost family. Seeing his sister, Diaz dashed toward her and hugged her. As they cried together, he realized that what he thought was lost forever had been returned to him. Diaz found his sister, Shelley, whom he had long presumed dead, standing and smiling before his eyes. He stared at her in a daze, calling out her name and asking what had happened to them after they were separated. Shelley smiled, holding onto his hand, and as they sat together at a table, she began to recount her ordeal. She described the absolute darkness she had waited in for what felt like eternity after being taken away. Just as it was her turn to be killed, a mysterious figure had entered the space, eliminating everyone around and rescuing her. She managed to escape into the light, but her troubles were not over. She was nearly sold to child traffickers afterward. It was then that the mercenary named Evan arrived and saved her once again. Shelley explained that since that day, she had consistently received packages of valuable medicine and financial support from an anonymous source. One letter explicitly stated that the medicine and gold were sent in the name of Palateo to ensure her safety, further noting that she need not worry about her brother. This message had come from Alan Palateo. Shelley admitted she owed her life to this man, causing Diaz to realize that our boy had even sworn on his own name to keep her safe. Diaz was struck by a profound sense of wonder, questioning how the Great Moon could possibly know everything. He had never once spoken of his history or family, and even Euthea only knew of his suffering at the hands of the Shadow Goats. He remembered Euthea's words vividly as the pieces of the puzzle finally came together to form a clearer image. He recognized that he had been the fool. He had never understood Euthea's anxiety before, but now her total devotion made sense. Everything Alan had said to Loria, that good things would come her way, played out as though he were a prophet. Diaz fathomed that even the mercy he had been shown was calculated, while he had bred nothing but hatred and vengeance toward the Shadow Goats since that treacherous day. This unexpected reunion was more than a gift. It was a miracle. He understood now that Euthea was neither a religious fanatic nor a fool. His mission was clear. He had to rise to the upper echelon of Caliburn, become a master knight, and form an order with the strongest swordsmen. In the present, a knight walked up to Diaz, mentioning that preparations were complete. Diaz turned to face his men of the solar eclipse, who were lined up and ready. He viewed this expedition north to fight the barbarians as a stepping stone to greatness, welcoming the adversity. He raised his sword to the sole path he had decided upon, determined to prove his worth and offer a gratitude befitting the Great Moon. The scene cut back to Alan in his own space, enjoying a moment of peace. He sat in relaxation, reading his books and wondering if the quiet was due to the children being grown. A sudden wind blew through, scattering the notes he had tucked inside his books and causing him to frantically grab at the flying papers. Since returning from the labyrinth, Alan had spent a vast amount of time researching utterances, leading to several analytical breakthroughs. He realized that each utterance produced a different mechanical effect. Bend enhanced the imperfections in magic to increase the area of effect, while Rebound trampled the spell's form to alter a projectile's course. Cobalt Luster strengthened spells cast in parallel, resulting in critical damage. He also identified strict rules. Incompatible utterances could not be used together, and a maximum of 4 could be active at once. Because of his small mana core, he could only perform magic once a day, making his research a slow, painstaking process. He found no historical descriptions of Bavaloya's hand seals or utterances, forcing him to rely entirely on his own experimentation. He stood up to check the results of 2 months of study, pulling forth lightning and performing the Bavaloya hand signs. He focused on eliminating the center of mana gathered in his sphere, intending to create lightning through the signs. He uttered the word clamp, causing the spell to jolt and encircle him. He then said collapse, resulting in the spell shrinking into a concentrated size. Finally, as he spoke the utterance, a moment's full bloom, lightning from the heavens struck down with a heavy surge. The impact struck a tree in front of him, causing a ripple of energy to vibrate through the entire building. Our boy was amazed, recognizing that the order of utterances was vital, as the spell had failed when he tried starting with collapse. Suddenly, Kalia and her butler walked into the space, looking at the destruction with shock. Kalia mentioned that what she saw was impossible, asking if it was origin. Alan was confused by the term, but the butler explained that origin was unique magic, a pinnacle only achieved by mages of the 7th tier and higher. This realization was shocking to Alan. He suddenly realized that through his use of the Bavaloya utterances, he had jolted upward to the level of a 7th or 8th tier mage. Pure disrespect to the natural laws of magic. Alan instructed Kalia and her butler to follow him into the drawing room of the Palateo Manor, maintaining his usual air of cold authority. As Kalia sat, she recognized that her visit served 2 distinct purposes. She sought to uncover the true intentions of a man who held enough leverage to devastate House Genunia. She had planned to use her magic to gauge the secret organization serving as his shield. However, those plans felt meaningless as she watched her butler, Bianchel, trembling beside her. Bianchel was a 5th tier mage, a man so powerful he had been banished from the arcane tower for his inhumane experiments, and was capable of toppling entire divisions alone. Despite being his patron for years, Kalia had only ever known him to be haughty and arrogant. Now, seeing him shaking in his boots, she sensed a primal fear radiating from him. She wondered if the magic she had witnessed earlier truly was origin. Alan broke the silence with a flat inquiry, asking what brought them to his manor. Kalia offered her sincerest apologies for the uninvited intrusion, claiming she had simply longed to meet him and stumbled upon the estate. Alan clarified that he would not fault her, but he insisted on correcting one point. The magic he used was not origin. He stated that it was merely 2nd tier magic. Inwardly, Alan reasoned that the spell was actually quite useless for both attack and defense, though he kept this revelation to himself. His guests, however, deduced a much darker meaning. They fathomed that Alan was essentially threatening them to remain silent about what they had seen. Bianchel quickly agreed, stammering that his eyes must have tricked him and that he hadn't seen a thing. Kalia found it strange to see the proud mage using such formal, submissive language. Satisfied that the misunderstanding was cleared, Alan asked again for the true reason for her visit. Kalia claimed she had business nearby and felt inclined to offer a greeting. Since she had no specific matter to discuss, Alan mentioned he had other tasks and prepared to end the conversation. Before leaving, Alan sternly suggested that if she were looking for someone to talk to, she should visit Duchess Altea, noting they would likely get along well. Kalia bowed, promising to heed his advice and pay her grace a long overdue visit. As she rode away in her carriage, Evan asked Alan why the rogues of the West would visit so suddenly. Alan admitted he had no idea, realizing that if word spread that he used origin magic, power-hungry rivals would swarm him. He calculated that by sending a Genunia woman to visit her underworld rival, Loria Altea, he might keep both of them busy and away from him. Inside the carriage, Bianchel explained the terror he felt. He deduced that while the magic wasn't technically origin, it was something far more impossible. He described origin as magic that etches its own laws, but noted that Alan's magic actually tore through the unyielding principles of the universe itself. By clamping lightning in place and twisting the laws until they collapsed, Alan had performed a miracle that should not be possible. Bianchel concluded that it was the forgotten magic of a great god, and warned Kalia never to antagonize the Count. Kalia, feeling a bead of sweat on her cheek, realized it was futile to try and discover his intentions. She recognized that after just one visit, she had already become one of his pawns. 5 months later, nearly 2 years since the children had departed, Evan brought news to Alan's office. He reported that House Genunia and House Altea had formed an alliance. Alan was shocked, wondering how the 2 behemoths of the underworld had joined hands. He feared that Asteria might be doomed, and wondered if Kalia had actually taken his casual advice. Brushing it off as a temporary collision, he decided a backup plan wouldn't hurt. He wrote a letter to Kalia, assuming a blunt and aloof tone to maintain his image, and instructed Evan to deliver it through the mercenary guild. Left alone, Alan wondered about the fates of Radon and Solon. He was particularly concerned about Solon and the desert nation of Kohloni, hoping she wasn't dead. He had sent her to find the essence of the Golden Mane tribe, a legendary item meant to enhance her deadly strikes by 20%. He reasoned that since Kohloni was a realm where strength conquered all, she would need that capital to survive. Deep inside a cave in the desert nation, Solon, the sin of sloth, exhaled in relief. She had finally completed the trial Alan had set for her. Looking at the gauntlet on her hand, she expressed her gratitude to the Great Moon. She recognized the artifact as the legendary essence of the Golden Mane, once thought to be a myth. She remembered childhood stories of being descendants of the Golden Mane, the king of all beasts, and realized those fables were true. Solon fathomed that the Great Moon was her true savior, having rescued her from human experimentation and granted her the power to eventually face the dark dragon that took her parents' lives. She understood that his true will wasn't for her to be a mere gladiator. Instead, her mission was to become the strongest fighter, reunite the scattered Golden Mane tribe, and use the essence to pommel her enemies. Looking up at the sky, she decided to begin her rise. Alan sat in his office discussing the latest reports with Evan, who mentioned that the Intelligence Guild had obtained rumors regarding the children. Evan admitted he had intended to share this at the training grounds the previous day, but had forgotten. Alan inquired about the nature of these rumors, prompting Evan to explain that Solon was performing so well in Kohloni that people had begun calling her the Golden Flash. Alan recognized the name as sounding eerily familiar, though he simply expressed his relief that she was doing well. Evan noted that such an outcome was expected, as that region was a place where only the strong thrived. When Alan asked about Radon, noting he had last heard of him arriving at Rashat to learn his trade, Evan explained that while they had some information, they were still verifying its reliability. Alan acknowledged this before noticing Evan lingering. He questioned if Evan was supposed to be busy, causing Evan to ask why he was receiving such a sudden, strange look since he had finished all his assigned tasks. Alan then reminded him that it took a month to travel to the Arcane Tower, and that he should prepare in advance. Evan was shocked, as Alan had not mentioned this plan before. Alan casually wondered if he had forgotten to tell him, though Evan noted he was used to such oversights by then. Alan clarified that while it only took a week to reach the Emerald Arcane Tower, Evan was actually headed to the Azure Arcane Tower near the Labyrinth City. Evan accepted the news, noting the distance, and left to begin preparations. Once alone, Alan sank into his chair, exhausted by the mere thought of living in a carriage for a month. He reasoned that despite the exhaustion, the Azure Tower was the only place he could obtain the one item capable of supplementing his small mana core. The mention of the Labyrinth City brought back memories of his time spent grinding there in the game. He remembered that the labyrinth in the center of the city was a popular leveling map where deeper ventures resulted in better items. He reflected on how, despite the influx of players, no one had ever reached the end of the seemingly endless maze that constantly dropped rare relics. Because of this, the profession of a certified arcane appraiser was in high demand and a certain way to get rich. Alan gathered from Euthia's letters that Renee was becoming a very skilled player in this regard. He understood that she was due to take the appraiser certification test soon, and was certain she would pass with flying colors. He wondered if Renee was being too modest compared to the others, as she had only asked for an item to help with appraisal rather than more funding. The scene shifted to Lartania, the labyrinthian city, a lawless territory of explorers and mercenaries. In the southern center of the city stood a secretive appraisal shop called Oculus, which catered to nobles and A-tier explorers. Inside, Renee, acting as an appraiser, informed a customer that her appraisal of his artifact was complete. She explained it was a device that used mana to create fire. The customer, surprised, asked about the nature of the fire. Renee detailed that a handful of mana was enough to maintain the flame for an hour, leading the man to laugh in delight at the improved mana efficiency. He offered his gratitude and departed. Renee took off her mask and turned her attention to a telescope in the corner. She knew this shop was famous for engraving, a gift she had received from the Great Moon. Initially, she hadn't understood why she was told to become an appraiser. She recognized that the Great Moon was a figure from the era of the Forgotten Outer Gods, and that everything done for him was for the eradication of the Dark Ones. Yet the instructions had seemed disconnected from slaughtering enemies. She only truly understood once she discovered the Eye of Instinct, a gift that identified objects below a certain mana threshold. She sensed that this item was different from any known archive. Upon finding it, the seal broke and the item revealed its true identity, unlocking the engraving ability she needed to fight the Dark Ones. She understood she had to awaken the item through offerings. The eye currently had 248 uses left out of 500. She used it to appraise the telescope, causing an emblem to appear, and noting she had 252 more offerings to go. She realized that in exchange for improving artifact properties, the eye absorbed energy to undergo a transformation. Because the eye only responded to high-tier artifacts, she knew all items had to be accurately appraised to avoid wasting energy. She held the artifact tight, determined to fulfill the Great Moon's will and slay the Black Wolves. 3 weeks later, Alan and Evan arrived at the Azure Arcane Tower. Inside, they met Phinia Crescen, the Deputy Tower Master, and a 6th-tier mage. She was a generational prodigy who had reached the 8th tier in her early 20s, commanding immense authority because the tower possessed significant combat strength and a monopoly on essential items. Phinia was busy and irritable, scrambling through documents and telling them to hurry up. Alan recognized her from the game and introduced himself as Count Palateo. He informed her he had come regarding the Time Rift, a crack formed by heavy magic usage that links to unknown spaces and causes anomalous damage. Phinia, annoyed by his low magic talent, told him he could leave. Alan insisted she listen, but she mockingly asked if he thought he was the first to barge in with such nonsense. Alan asked for the benefit of the doubt, but Phinia released a wave of awful mana, causing the space to tremble as she insulted his family. Evan feared they were doomed if they angered her further. Desperate, Alan walked forward and offered to hand over all his assets if he failed to close the rift. He offered to swear an oath, arguing it was a small price for her time. Phinia was lost for words but ultimately accepted the deal, escorting them to the rift. She warned him that if he failed, everything owned by House Palateo would be hers. Alan agreed with absolute composure. Phinia watched him, concluding he was likely a nobody who had lucked into his position and was biting off more than he could chew. She noted his insignificant mana core and how he barely lingered at the 2nd tier. She reasoned that while rifts usually spit out an artifact and dissolve after 3 months, this specific rift had persisted for 2 years and looked ominous. She told Alan to leave if he couldn't do anything, but she then realized he was using his hands as a medium rather than a staff, a technique ancient tombs described as primitive. She dismissed it as a fairy tale imitation and told him to go. Alan paid her no mind and began to chant. Suddenly, the entire space paused. Phinia recognized that she couldn't move. Everything had frozen. She saw Alan before her, but she also saw a closed, ominous eye. The moment the eye opened, the weight of its energy descended upon her. She was consumed by terror, and as the figure stretched out a hand, she found herself paralyzed, unable to move even an inch. The figure commanded absolute silence, causing Phinia to break into a heavy sweat. She intuitively understood the demand, and, as the figure's gaze focused and its eyes slowly closed once more, she instantly halted her analysis to avoid further provocation. Suddenly, the trance snapped, and the world returned to motion as Alan finished his work. He casually mentioned that the rift was closed, causing Phinia to jolt in shock. Alan deduced that the task had been a piece of cake, though he knew he had only succeeded by using a specific method and a special item. He informed her that he would be taking the artifact from the rift. He noted that he had only used the right words for effect, hoping his bluff was convincing enough to ensure her silence. Phinia, still visibly shaken, stammered that she would not say a word. Alan found her reaction amusing, assuming she simply didn't buy his bluff. But, as he stepped toward her, she flinched and retreated. She began to scream that she would keep the secret, swearing she wouldn't tell a soul and insisting she was telling the truth. Alan was confused by her sudden flustered behavior, but decided to ignore it, heading outside to meet Evan. As they prepared to leave, Phinia's voice cut through the air again, pleading for them to wait. She hurried over and presented Alan with mana recovery potions she had concocted herself, insisting he accept them. Alan took the vials, recognizing them as the best of their kind, coming from a deputy tower master. He was confused, knowing these potions usually cost a fortune, and remembering how he had once done a double take at their price. Looking at Phinia's unsettled state, he reasoned she was thanking him for closing the rift. Phinia then frantically reiterated her promise of silence, and suddenly suggested they make a mana oath. Alan was uncomfortable, fathoming that an oath for something so trivial was unnecessary. But before he could object, Phinia began the chant. Magical chains entangled Alan as the oath was sealed, causing Phinia to look relieved, claiming she was excellent at keeping promises. Alan realized he couldn't undo her misunderstanding and simply left, having obtained 5 vials of high-grade potion, the artifact he needed, and a binding oath. Back in the carriage, Evan inspected the artifact, a bangle on Alan's wrist, and remarked that it looked average considering the trouble. Alan admitted he wasn't entirely sure of its full power yet, but he knew it was a sigil of corruption and essential for his needs. The Bangle's gems began absorbing mana from the atmosphere. It was already working. While it didn't store a massive amount, it was more than enough to compensate for his poor mana core. He looked out the window, feeling a bit gloomy that a piece of equipment held more mana than he did, but he reminded himself that his goal was research and protection, not frontline battle, so it's essentially good enough. He wondered about Fenia's complete 180-degree turn in attitude, especially since she had even escorted him to his carriage and wished him a safe journey. He had tried to clarify that he was only a second-tier mage, but she had simply responded that she was well aware of his current level, clearly not believing him. He noted that her reaction mirrored Kalia's and her butler's fear, which made him uneasy, but he shrugged it off, deciding he'd never have to see them again anyway. The scene shifted to the Altea estate, where Loria sat with Kalia. They discussed how comfortable they felt together, ignoring rank and authority. Kalia recalled Alan's instruction to visit the Duchess and realized his underlying intention. They both understood they were now acting under the will of Count Palateo, leading to an alliance established by his command. They recognized that a power struggle was meaningless against his absolute influence, causing the houses of Genonia and Altea to easily form an amicable relationship. Loria asked what had brought Kalia there today, and Kalia presented a letter from Alan. The letter apologized for his cold behavior during her visit and mentioned complaints from other nobles. Kalia noted that while it looked like a typical apology, there were hidden instructions within the names mentioned. They analyzed the list: Baron Kinya, Count Malatino, Viscount Volandes, and Duke Faldion. Loria concluded that Alan was unhappy with both the noble and royalist factions. They deduced that his true instruction was to eliminate the current factions and form a new one. Loria understood now why he had helped her become a duchess and allied her with the overlord of the West. They began to discuss their plan to host the nobles and reshape the political landscape. Back at the Azure Arcane Tower, Fenia sat at her desk looking depressed. When the Tower Master entered, surprised that the rift had been closed, he asked for details. Fenia looked up as the pieces of the puzzle began to arrange themselves in a chaotic new order in her mind. Meanwhile, in a forest, Alan sat with Evan, sneezing heavily while eating a sweet potato. He nearly choked, prompting Evan to give him water. Alan admitted to feeling a bit homesick while camping, but he mentioned that he expected a letter from Euthea any day now. Far away, Euthea stood before a massive statue, looking elegant and smiling as she gazed upward. The scene returned to the Azure Arcane Tower, where the Tower Master, Micardo, called out for his disciple Fenia. Upon entering the office, he noted that the pressure from the time rift was gone, prompting him to ask if something had happened. He found Fenia looking uncharacteristically gloomy. She rose her head and simply mentioned that she had finished the work he entrusted to her. Micardo gathered a sense of dread, wondering if something serious had occurred, as she was not getting mad at him as usual. Her head fell with a heavy thud back onto the table, causing Micardo to reflect on her nature. Fenia had become the Vice Tower Master at an early age due to her blessed talents, resulting in an arrogance that pierced the sky. She was known for making rookies cry without a second thought. Micardo had never intended to fix her personality, reasoning that once she reached the seventh circle and understood the true scale of magic, she would naturally become modest. However, this sudden change was strange. He mentioned that his business trip to the north had been long, and asked if she had been overwhelmed in his absence. Fenia looked up, appearing as though she were about to cry, and revealed that the Count had closed the time rift. Micardo sat down in surprise, but Fenia explained she could not provide details because she had sworn an oath. Micardo deduced that whatever Fenia had witnessed must have been an incomprehensible magic, perhaps even origin magic, to have humbled her so completely. He patted her on the head, noting that she was so scared she didn't even swat his hand away. He found the idea of Alan Palateo of the Asteria Kingdom to be very interesting. A month after returning from the Blue Magic Tower, Alan was back at the Palateo Manor. Having obtained the wristband, he could use more magic per day, allowing him to start his research on phrases in earnest. He carefully followed the established constraints, never using mismatched phrases, avoiding repetition, and limiting the array to 4 elements. As he worked, Evan walked in, observing the training. Alan mentioned he was still unsure how the placement of the phrases affected the outcome, but Evan remarked that the magic grew stronger every time he witnessed it. Evan noted that while it had once seemed like second circle magic, it was now on an entirely different level. Alan reasoned that an average gravity spell shouldn't be able to create a crater like the one before them. Gravity was second circle magic, and even at maximum output, It shouldn't be enough to crush something to death. He realized that the increase in power was not an illusion. Evan sensed that the deviation was peculiar, as an increase in proficiency usually meant better precision, and phrases were merely trigger words to alter attributes. Alan had been using nearly the same phrases in alteration, leading him to conclude that while power usually increased gradually through fine-tuning, there was no logical reason for the firepower to surge so suddenly. He simply told Evan that he must be in better condition nowadays. Evan agreed and handed over a letter from Euthea that had just arrived. Alan thanked him, deciding to read it in his room after having used up his 3 daily spells. As he walked, Alan pondered the source of his strength. He wondered if it was a course, an oriental ritual where a caster sacrifices something to gain a compensatory reward. He then wondered if he was receiving faith, but quickly deduced that it made no sense for the underworld to suddenly start worshipping a count from a small kingdom. He decided to forget about it and move on. The scene shifted to the Holy Kingdom of Rosario, specifically the capital city of Chironia, a pure white city where people worshipped the goddess of moon and peace. Inside the East Prayer House, Euthea stood before a statue as a man named Loki approached her. Euthea greeted him warmly, asking if he had been well. Loki, despite being a paladin who outranked a nun, showed her deep respect and bowed. He reported that they had saved 8 children and 25 lives from a village in the east and west, attributing the success to her. Euthea smiled, stating that he was the one who executed the good deeds. For 20 years, Loki had lived in despair, unable to feel divine power. He had been on the verge of giving up until Euthea had dropped a sword in front of him and told him to try having faith in the moon. When he asked what she meant, she told him he would figure it out through action. Desperate, Loki had prayed to the moon for days, miraculously feeling divine energy surge into his sword. Though he initially feared he had stepped into heresy by placing faith in the moon rather than goddess Junonia, he realized the power felt the same. One night, he had asked Euthea why she told him to believe in the moon. She explained that faith takes a long time to manifest, but it is easier to obtain what you need from something that actually exists. She told him the moon would always be with him. Looking into her eyes, Loki recognized that for her, the goddess and the moon were one and the same. He realized this was her way of allowing doubtful humans to believe with certainty. Loki thanked her from the bottom of his heart. And now, in the present, Euthea invited him to pray with her, noting that many had already gathered. They walked into the church where a crimson light shone upon the congregation. Reaching the altar, Euthea looked elegant and composed, as she commanded the gathering to pray to the great moon. She was spreading the word of the moon to everyone, and in that space, the moon itself shone bright. The scene returned to the Palateo Manor office, where Alan sat going through the day-to-day trivia of his updates. He read through a letter, noting that there wasn't much of substance within the lines, which led him to decide he should be happy that everyone was seemingly doing well, but feeling a small sting of hurt that only Euthea sent him regular correspondence. He reasoned that if he put himself in the children's shoes, this was to be expected. They had never actually met him in person, meaning he was likely just a random benefactor they were grateful to rather than a familiar figure. He twirled his hand over his papers, concluding that since he had steered them toward the path of righteousness instead of an apocalypse, his job was effectively finished. He tried to console himself with inner peace, while acknowledging that Euthea must be incredibly busy yet still found time for monthly updates. He recognized that out of the 5 kids he had helped grow, only the eldest seemed to recognize his efforts. He was inwardly crying over the lack of attention. Evan suddenly called out to him, asking if he was busy, causing Alan to jolt in fright. Alan admitted he hadn't realized Evan was still in the room. Evan approached the table, explaining that he had received more intel from the Intelligence Guild regarding the other children. He mentioned that Raiden, whom Alan had asked about previously, had apparently become a pirate. Upon hearing this, Alan's body froze in shock. He urged Evan to tell him the entire story from beginning to end, as he had not anticipated such a development. Evan sat him down and first detailed the progress of Solon and Dias. He explained that Solon had already achieved 32 consecutive victories. Out of the 100 she needed to challenge for the title of Baba Yaga, Alan asked who held the record for the most victories, and Evan identified the Lion King, who held a 41-win streak. Alan knew from the game that the Lion King was a seriously powerful character, who only joined the party temporarily. Since Koloni relied on strong warriors for military strength, Solon was on a path to surpass the very best of them. Evan continued, noting that Deus's knights had eliminated Kurga of the Tombstone and visited Alexandra, one of the 8 barbarian chiefs, standing victorious over their territory, describing them as monsters who achieved superhuman strength through rituals. Alan knew them well, remembering how the game forced players to fight the barbarians and their god, Ultultus. He was glad he didn't have to face that god himself, as he only appeared after the 5 prime sins awakened. He concluded that he no longer had to worry about Deus, especially since the boy was now receiving treatment similar to Delman, the third sword of Caliburn. Alan considered that he might have seen a nice return on his investment if he had gone to see him personally. Evan then mentioned that Renee had become a successful appraiser at her shop, applying dark engravings to artifacts to boost their abilities. Alan noted that she was doing well for herself, but he quickly brought the conversation back to Raiden. Evan explained that while it sounded simple, Raiden had become the captain ruling over the first archipelago of the 7 archipelagos off the coast of Raxath. Alan shriveled in fear at the realization. He had sponsored an orphan for years, wanting him to live a normal life, only to hear the boy had run off to become a pirate. He recalled an old online post and realized with annoyance that it had become a reality. He told Evan that he hadn't sent Raiden to Raxath for that purpose. He knew that Raiden's best trait was enemy detection, and that as a Seaborn he could move freely underwater where precious artifacts were hidden. Alan had suggested he become a treasure hunter, and even gave him a gift to enhance his detection. Evan tried to cheer him up, noting that being the lord of the biggest archipelago was a significant achievement. Alan wondered how Raiden had even defeated the captain of the first archipelago, as all the captains were superhumans who were nearly invincible in naval combat. He concluded that Raiden must have used elite gear found at the bottom of the sea to beat them. Alan felt the sting of life not going his way, and almost fell over, causing Evan to scream out in concern for his lord. The scene shifted to the heart of Raxath in the great ocean city. Off the coast lay the 7 pirates' paradises, with the first archipelago being the greatest among them. The harbor had once been ruled by Kraeld the Slayer, a pirate who had received a blessing from the Divine King through an offering. However, his post had been claimed by the new lord, Raiden, the sin of obsession. Raiden stood tall with pride, looking outward while sitting on a pillar. He wondered about the true identity of the Great Moon, a figure he had never cared enough to ponder before. He felt thankful to the man for rescuing him from human experiments and helping him awaken his abilities through Euthia. However, when he was with the Blue Moon, he felt he was serving Euthia, and he hadn't understood why the Great Moon wanted him to be a treasure hunter. He had felt rebellious, wanting revenge for his people who were massacred by the Dark Ones. He remembered how his parents were brutally killed by hunters, and how he was sold to traffickers. He had initially planned to only pretend to follow the Great Moon's instructions. However, he had spotted a boat full of people from a wanted poster having a party. They were celebrating the Divine King's blessing, but Raiden recognized them as the monsters responsible for his family's death. He realized the captains of the 7 archipelagos obtained their power from Clyad, the god of the sea, through a ritual requiring the flesh of a Seaborn. Seeing them celebrate their atrocities made him furious, as he knew they had split his parents' flesh among the 7 of them. He stood there, consumed by the need for his long-awaited revenge. Raiden stood atop the rugged cliffs, staring out at the horizon while pondering how the Great Moon could have known about the opportunity that had presented itself. He had never shared his history with anyone, yet it felt as if the Great Moon had prepared this specific chance for revenge just to fulfill a silent promise. He folded his fist tightly, recognizing that despite his burning desire, he could not take his revenge immediately. His enemies were superhumans who wielded the power of the sea god, putting them temporarily out of his reach. He reasoned that if everything truly was intentional, then there must be a reason for the medallion he held in his hand. He was sure that the Great Moon had arranged every detail of his path, leading him to pray once more to the entity that had laid the foundation for his retribution. The scene shifted to the early hours, where Raiden was seen sprinting through the dense forest before jumping from a high cliff into the crashing waves below. He swam deep into the ocean, utilizing his skill for locating artifacts. Within the Great Moon's gift were Amrita's goggles, which made it easy to find treasures hidden in the deep. The specific artifacts he recovered were more than enough to supplement his lack of strength. Upon surfacing, he equipped the artifacts onto his body, feeling a surge of power. He realized how foolish he had been to offer only a simple thank you to the Great Moon. Not only had the target of his revenge been delivered right to him, but he had also been granted the power to exert that revenge through these hidden artifacts. Raiden smiled, finally fathoming the true intention behind the command in the letter, to exert his revenge and seize control of the 7 archipelagos. He remembered the words Euthia always spoke, telling them that everything was for the Great Moon. What had once been a simple sentence had gradually become a light of trust, causing the purpose of the Great Moon to be engraved deep inside his heart. 3 months later, the stifling heat had faded, giving way to the autumn season and the Bernal Astra grand social gathering. Alan was in his carriage, having been forced to tag along for the event. He mentioned to Evan that attendance was mandatory once every 4 years, and he made no secret of his hatred for the gathering. As they traveled, the carriages of the Kreld and Eden families joined them as planned. Alan deduced that traveling in a large group was the only way to avoid trouble with bandits, though he found the culture annoying. Upon arriving that evening, Alan was immediately accosted by a group of nobles. They mocked him, suggesting that having only one guard was a bit much, and asking if his treasury was in trouble since he had accidentally inherited his titles. To Alan, the problem wasn't bandits, but the nobles who insisted on talking rubbish to his face. He wished they would simply talk behind his back instead. These men were spitting venom at him, which was expected given his long-standing reputation as a scoundrel. The power of the Palateo family had been built on funds funneled from the Eastern Underworld, but since Alan was satisfied with his current life, he had washed his hands of those dangerous depths. Because he had stepped away, the Eastern Underworld was being targeted by bottom feeders, causing rumors to spread that Alan had only become a count through pure luck. The gossip that he was a mastermind had died down, replaced by the belief that he was merely a lucky brat. The men continued to laugh at him, offering to help if he was short on funds. Alan realized these jerks were crossing the line, and recognized them as the Palateo Victims Association. The Kreld and Eden families, who used to be pushovers for the Palateo house, were now venting their resentment. Alan felt like he was dealing with petty internet trolls. Evan walked up to him carrying a bowl of corn and gave him credit for even trying to talk to the men. Alan knew that ignoring them was the best answer. He asked Evan where he had been, and Evan explained they were handing out roasted corn in the kitchen. They began to munch on the corn, completely ignoring the insults. One of the nobles suggested that the underworld troops had vanished because Alan couldn't manage them. But to Alan, the insults were starting to sound like background music. Evan even remarked that the corn would be better with butter, demonstrating their complete lack of concern for the petty nobles. The scene then cut to the north, a freezing land swallowed by barbarians where life seemed to have vanished. The ground was littered with the bodies of lifeless men following an all-out war. One man, on the brink of death, struggled against his fate, cursing the Caliburn Knights for having no honor. He was one of the 8 Kolkhan barbarian chiefs. To the barbarians, who worship battle, death in combat is glorious. But this defeat resulted from a cowardly surprise attack after he fell for a trap during a proposed duel. As he lay in shambles, wondering what had happened to Kurga of the Snowfields, he realized he could not even close his eyes in peace. Suddenly, an anonymous voice called out to him, commanding the chief to call upon a great name, the name they all worshipped. The man muttered the name Ultultus. Upon saying it, his body began to shake, and he mustered the strength to rise. He screamed the name of the great god Ultultus, who heard him clearly. The god glared at him, promising to grant his heart's desire. The uncomfortable coexistence persisted as the procession moved toward the palace for the social gathering. Even with the addition of other noble families, the mockery directed at Alan never ceased. He remained in the middle of the group, completely unbothered, choosing to ignore the insults. He reasoned that feeding the trolls was against basic etiquette, leading him to maintain a mask of indifference. That evening they arrived at a resting spot, and settled in to eat the fish they had caught that day. The nobles became increasingly annoyed by Alan's silence, sensing that their attempts to provoke him were failing. The men whispered among themselves, asking about the additional escort force. One nobleman mentioned that he had checked and found only a lunatic knight accompanying the brat. They questioned how such people could marry into nobility, concluding that the rumors of the Palateo family's decline were true. They decided to execute their plan to enter the underworld immediately, glad to be finished with tiptoeing around the Palateo name. They felt a surge of excitement at the prospect of seizing the astronomical wealth and power circulating in those dark depths. Looking at Alan, they joked about giving him a gift once they took control, laughing that he would be grateful after they taught him how terrifying the world really was. Suddenly, screams erupted from the back of the camp as everyone's attention was drawn to the forest. A group of monsters had emerged to attack. The knights scrambled, shouting for the mages to secure the field of vision. As the mages chanted and lit up the clearing, they revealed creatures that looked like ogres, yet possessed strange crystals growing from their bodies. Despite their size, the noblemen confused them for goblins, believing them to be weak forest monsters. However, the sheer numbers were overwhelming. The creatures were infused with mana, meaning their physical abilities were completely different from anything they had encountered. Just as the monsters dashed forward to slaughter the knights, a massive rock wall erupted from the ground, blocking their path. The creature slammed into the stone and fell back, confused by the sudden barrier. One mage stood in shock, recognizing the combination of third-tier rock wall and second-tier shield magic. Unbeknownst to the crowd, it was Alan who had cast the spells. Using his bracelets to enforce more mana, our boy whispered the commands for enhancement and compression. The rocks beneath the monsters began to shift like an avalanche, causing the creatures to fall into the churning earth. Alan then used a gravity-based pull, causing the remaining monsters to levitate as a strange energy dragged them into the air. He called out the word vacuum, followed by a command to return to the primordial while performing intricate hand signs. The levitating rocks suddenly shot downward with sharp speed, striking the monsters on the ground and causing them to splatter in an instant. In less than 10 minutes, Alan had made quick work of the horde. The nobles and knights stood in astonishment, looking at the man they had mocked only moments ago. Alan told them not to stand there spacing out and commanded them to get ready for the remaining creatures still in the sky. The knights took their stances as the battle resumed. Our boy used his magic to disrupt the remaining monsters with unexpected attacks, working in perfect symbiosis with Evan. By dawn, every creature had been annihilated. As the sunlight touched the field, the nobles emerged from hiding, looking at Alan with newfound reverence. Alan, however, felt uncomfortable. He reasoned that he had almost been sent to the grave, as his spell capacity was still limited. After casting 3 or 4 major spells, his pitiful mana pool was completely empty, leaving him as an ordinary person for the remainder of the fight. Evan checked on him, asking if he was injured. Alan claimed he was fine, though he secretly fathomed that losing the ability to protect himself in the middle of a fight was terrifying. He recognized that moving with the nobles had been a good call, despite the noise. Alan stared at the purple crystals, fathoming that this was the real problem. He realized this was a divine descent, a phenomenon where an outer god attempts to manifest. The monsters affected by it become ferocious and physically enhanced. He reasoned that this shouldn't be happening yet, as these fringe outer gods were only supposed to appear after the laws of the world collapsed following the descent of the 5 great sins. Since the children hadn't even awakened as the sins yet, he understood that he needed to gather more information immediately. But as they walked back to their carriage, the once bullies began to cower in fear after witnessing Alan's strength. Next day, they finally arrived at the Rotegre ducal house. Alan climbed down from the carriage looking visibly sick, though he was happy the journey had ended. He noted that after hardship came even more hardship as they entered the Grand Cathedral for the gathering. Alan was so exhausted he could barely carry himself, leading Evan to slowly push him up the stairs. Alan whispered that he simply wanted to go home and sleep. The ball finally commenced, causing the grand hall to fill with a sea of people, engaged in lively conversation and dancing. Alan stood by the corner, observing the opulence as he mentioned to Evan that it was a perfect place for a social gathering, noting how everything seemed to be made of gold. Evan reasoned that the purpose was purely to show off wealth, suggesting that while they might not even notice if a piece went missing, the display felt tacky for some reason. Nearby, a man stood surrounded by ladies, laughing as he referred to them as his little baby birds who wouldn't let him be. Another man told him to be extra mindful of his health amidst such attention. Alan watched them from a distance, deciding that he shouldn't try to interact with the other nobles, as he simply didn't feel like it. He concluded that keeping his distance was the best course of action. Suddenly, a voice called out to him, causing him to turn and wonder why someone was seeking his attention. It was the same group that had mocked him earlier, but their demeanor had shifted entirely. They approached with forced laughter, asking if he could spare some time for them. They presented him with an offering, claiming it was the highest quality meat from their territory, and even suggesting they send support to the Palateo lands. Alan was baffled by the sudden change in behavior, but he quickly deduced that they had witnessed his power and were now trying to leech off him or stay in his good graces. His expression became intense as he processed the situation, causing the men to shrivel under his gaze. They felt a sudden sense of emergency, realizing they should never have messed with him in the first place. The cause of their terror dated back to the day before. As Alan and Evan had walked away from the clearing, the nobles had huddled together, discussing the magic they had witnessed. Desperate for answers, they had hurried toward Baron Alman and practically dragged his hired mage away for questioning. They asked the third circle mage if what Alan had used was merely second circle magic, but she looked at them in disbelief. She explained that there was no way it was second circle. The caliber of that magic had easily surpassed her own abilities as a third circle practitioner. The men had realized then that Alan was at least above the third circle, causing them to recognize that he had not become the Count by luck alone. They were consumed by fear, realizing he had been hiding a level of strength that required no escort. They saw his cold and cruel glare as a reflection of the notorious Palateo nature, leading them to believe that only bribes and desperate apologies could save their lives. Back at the ball, they bowed low in front of Alan, pleading for forgiveness for their arrogance and claiming they had been out of their minds. Alan stood there in confusion, wondering what they were doing and how they could have possibly gotten the wrong idea about him. Evan asked if he should take them out, but Alan mentioned that making a fuss would only be more tiring. He recognized that while he was usually merciful, they had crossed the line this time. Even though he knew his mana was currently too low to actually follow through on a threat, he decided to let them be as scared as they wanted. He maintained a heavy, petty energy, causing the men to shrivel further in the knowledge that they were screwed. As the ball continued, Alan began to scout for news, having already sent his information to the guild. He noticed two men having a secret conversation at a corner and decided to enhance his hearing with mana to listen in. He heard them discussing the alliance between Duchess Altia and the Genonia family, expressing disbelief that such a faction had been formed. This wasn't major news to Alan, as he assumed the masters of those two houses wouldn't get along for long. He moved on to munching on an egg tart, finding it absolutely delicious, but his focus snapped back as the conversation between the two nobles grew more serious. One man whispered that there was something even more surprising and urged the other to keep it secret. He revealed that the true head of this new faction wasn't one of the two heads of those houses. Alan paused his eating, wondering who could possibly be leading them. The informant's revelation that Alan was the true leader of the faction sent a shock through him, causing him to drop his egg tart to the floor in pure bewilderment. He had no idea he was supposedly leading a political movement, and he puzzled over how such news could have spread. He reasoned that he had only met Duchess Altia once as a child and had barely crossed paths with the daughter of the Genonia family, yet the rumors were treating his leadership as an established fact. He sighed, fathoming that the gossip was entirely baseless. Yet before he could process the confusion, he was interrupted yet again. A man approached and identified himself as Carmine, the third son of Duke Comelon from the Ashtalon kingdom. Alan acknowledged that foreign nobles often attended these grand gatherings and introduced himself as Count Palateo. Carmine looked down at him with a sneer, mentioning he had heard Alan became a count by mere luck and asking what his secret was. Alan realized the man was a piece of work, thinking to himself that even twisted donuts seemed to be talking these days. Before Alan could respond, another noble from the corner barked at Carmine, asking if he was mocking a noble of the Asteria kingdom. Carmine began to fluster, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. He had previously been a man of high standing, a romantic figure who had come to propose to the youngest daughter of House Rotegre. However, his habit of openly judging women had caused his fiancée to reconsider the marriage, leading to its cancellation. Annoyed and seeking a target for his frustration, Carmine had spotted Alan, whom he viewed as an immature noble with no connections, and decided to vent his anger on him. Carmine's plan backfired instantly as the nobles of Asteria stood up for our boy. They questioned if Carmine had lost his respect for their long-standing alliance, berating him until he felt small. Alan watched the situation with interest, recognizing the three men who had stepped in. Despite his indifference to politics, he deduced that these were the central axes of the Asteria kingdom. Duke Rotegre and Marquis Mardano, pillars of the royalist and noble factions, were standing alongside Count Palin of the moderate faction. Duke Rotegre suggested that perhaps Duke Comelon was looking down on them, a claim Carmine desperately tried to deny. Count Palin asked why Carmine had addressed a noble by name so disrespectfully, causing Carmine to bow his head in shame and admit his mistake. Alan found it amusing that these three, who barely knew him, were protecting him so fiercely. He realized they were acting like his personal soldiers, forcing Carmine to apologize until the young man sobbed and ran off, begging for forgiveness for his discourtesy. The Duke, Marquis, and Count then turned to Alan, asking if he was all right. Alan confirmed he was, though he was becoming scared by how these important figures were treating the rumors as truth. He realized that if things continued at this rate, his life would become incredibly bothersome. He considered letting them know it was all baseless gossip, but Marquis Mardano interrupted his thoughts. The Marquis mentioned he had heard Alan was researching magic and offered to gift him an artifact that could contain mana. Duke Rotegre and Count Palin immediately followed suit, offering their own gifts. Though Alan knew he should clear the air, he couldn't beat the temptation of the high-level items. He maintained his silence, resulting in him obtaining 2 magic artifacts and 5 mana potions. At dawn, inside Duke Rotegre's annex, the Marquis sat with a guest who asked how the interaction had gone. Marquis Mardano responded with satisfaction that Alan had accepted the gifts. He reasoned that, while light gifts were mere greetings, artifacts carried a much deeper meaning. In the world of nobility, presenting such a gift to the head of a faction and having it accepted was a significant gesture of alliance. His guest, Duchess Altia, expressed her pleasure at the news. Duke Rotegre laughed, giving her the credit for the plan as they welcomed the Marquis into their circle. The alliance was officially forged, with Alan placed, unbeknownst to him, at the very center of the storm. She questioned Marquess Mardano about the others, prompting him to confirm that it was an honor and that the other nobles had obliged willingly. Mardano recognized Duchess Altia as an elusive and formidable figure who had personally appeared to deliver messages to a select few. He deduced that she had carefully chosen the necessary pieces for her game, putting them through a rite of passage using worthy offerings. He glared at her, realizing he had to seize this opportunity while the Duchess noted that she could finally make her move. 4 days had passed since the start of the banquet, causing the spores of gossip to add up little by little. Alan remained in the area, reasoning that everyone was being exceptionally kind to him due to the rumors linking him to the houses of Altia and Genonia. He decided not to say no to the freebies, as it was unlikely the nobles would take them back, leading him to indulge in purely greedy thoughts for the moment. Suddenly, someone tapped him on the shoulder, causing our boy to shriek in fear. Evan, the one responsible, asked if he had startled him, explaining that he had just returned. They retreated to a silent space where Evan broke down the intelligence he had gathered. He explained that things were quite chaotic at Caliburn, where scholars speculated that the amethyst was connected to an outer god based on ancient records. Alan asked about the specific location he had been seeking, and Evan confirmed that the person was in a village in northern Astalon. Alan decided they would pass through there on their way to Caliburn. Evan noted the suddenness of the plan and asked if Alan truly intended to go to the north, to which Alan promised to fill him in on the details during the journey. Alan leaned back in his chair, looking distraught as he admitted to himself that he really didn't want this to happen. He recognized that outer deities were entities as calamitous as the 5 prime sins. While an incident of divine passion was not enough evidence to decide which outer god would descend or when, he had gathered information as quickly as possible. He began to tear up, realizing that despite the thousands of hours he had invested in the game, the path to Caliburn was more dangerous than he had hoped. He had seen hundreds of ways the story could go, and could already fathom how this would play out. The world would be tainted by the power of otherworldly realms, causing the union of kingdoms to collapse through senseless war. He reasoned that after its descent, an outer deity undergoes a chrysalis phase before awakening as a human god. Since its power cannot fully manifest during this phase, he understood it was the best time to strike. Although there was no guarantee, he readied himself to try. The scene then cut to Deus, who had just received a letter from his vice-captain. Upon reading it, its content made him so nervous, and so he instructed his vice-captain to tell everyone that the upcoming northern expedition is to be postponed by 2 weeks. The scene then moved to the Patron village, northern Ashterlon. Alan was there, looking at a young boy who he considered a very easy guy to spot, as he was beaming with optimism, causing Alan to recognize him as Elian, the main character of the game he once played. Alan noted that the boy matched the illustrations perfectly, though he found it strange to be talking to the character he had once controlled. Alan bent over and asked the boy if he knew who he was. Elian politely responded that he was simply happy to make his acquaintance. Alan reasoned that even in this wretched, dark fantasy world, the main character was destined to be the star of the show, possessing the power to become renowned. He complimented the boy's politeness and extended his hand, giving him gold. He then called for Evan, who brought out mana crystals, bottled ointments, and various gifts originally intended for Alan. Evan presented the vast array of items to Elian, telling him they were all for him. Elian stood in shock, asking why he was receiving such treasures. Alan explained that it was an investment, having brought everything that would help a protagonist develop early on. He told the boy he was going to become big one day, while inwardly hoping the boy would hurry up and become strong enough to kill the outer god. Alan saw that Elian was moved, causing him to believe he had gained the boy's favor. Alan realized he had forgotten to introduce himself properly, and told the boy he was Count Palateo. He told Elian to remember the name of the patron he had to thank once he made it big. Elian waved and screamed his thanks, promising never to forget this kindness. Alan wondered if the boy was always this cheerful, noting that he was a bright spot in a dark world. Evan mentioned that while he understood the investment, he wondered if it was fine to leave without talking to the child more thoroughly. Alan responded that he didn't have time to earn friendship points when his life was on the line. He reasoned that he only needed to point the main character in the right direction and set him on autopilot. Evan noted that the child possessed immense potential and was shrouded in powerful mana, suspecting he was already equipped with an artifact. Alan confirmed he felt the mana too, though he noted that in the original lore, Elian was supposed to be an ordinary kid before his adventure. He realized this was likely a butterfly effect, resulting from his own changes to the story. He concluded that the stronger Elian became, the better his own blissful future would be. Alan then turned his thoughts toward Deus. He asked Evan if Deus was going to meet with him, realizing with a sense of dread that he had never once visited the orphanage because he was too scared. He wondered what to do as the situation reached a turning point. Evan responded that he was sure they would meet, though Alan sensed it was only a matter of probability. 10 days later, they finally arrived at Kidram, the capital of Caliburn. Standing before the massive northern gate, Evan appeared utterly exhausted, leading Alan to observe that long journeys are bound to wear one down. Evan mentioned that if not for the bizarre labyrinth they had encountered at the end of their trek, he might have been able to at least hold his head high. Alan reasoned that their detour couldn't be helped, as they had traveled from place to place to prepare for the looming war against the outer gods. He thought of the gifts they had received along the way, wondering if those who eventually received them would be pleased. Our boy felt a swell of pride, likening his actions to the heart of a father who wishes to give without restraint. As they joined the long line of carriages waiting to enter the city, Evan explained that the capital inspection should be nothing more than a simple identity verification. Alan waved him off, sitting back in the carriage and feeling relieved that things moved quickly in this world. However, his peace was short-lived when a voice called out to him, reporting that a slight issue had arisen. Alan descended from the carriage, demanding to know why they were being told to step aside. Evan confirmed that Alan's identity had been verified, yet a problem persisted. A man stood nearby, smiling with a sense of superiority as he introduced himself as Viran, the direct disciple of Master Knight Fiola, the Fourth Sword. Alan searched his memory, but deduced that he had no idea who Fiola was. He asked Viran what the meaning of this confrontation was, especially since Viran had brought a squad of knights with him. Viran explained that a friend in the Asteria Kingdom had sent word of a debt, claiming he had been humiliated beyond measure. Alan immediately sensed the truth, realizing the friend was none other than Carmine. Viran revealed that Carmine had asked him to cripple the man heading to Caliburn, promising that Viran could use Alan's body to improve his skills with abyssal bodies. Viran admitted he owed Carmine a favor and intended to put on a show. 8 knights surrounded Alan and Evan. Alan looked around, disgusted that Carmine had picked a fight and run away, only to send others to finish it. Viran suggested that if Alan handed over every valuable inside the carriage, he might consider leniency. He viewed Alan as a fringe noble, with no influence or ties to Caliburn, causing him to believe there was nothing to lose by shaking him down. This situation truly angered Alan, who recognized that birds of a feather truly flock together. He picked the wrong one today. As Viran prepared to swing his strike, thinking his master would smooth over any trouble, Alan began to infuse magic into his hand. Suddenly, someone grabbed Viran from behind and hoisted him into the air. Deus Macallion stepped into the scene, rendering Viran completely vulnerable. Both Alan and Evan watched in surprise as Deus asked Viran what he thought he was doing. Viran struggled, unable to move, as Deus roared at him for daring to lay a hand upon his benefactor. The cruel truth Viran failed to grasp was that Alan had already triumphed in a duel against Karga of the Snowfields. Deus struck Viran to the ground and stepped on his head before pulling him back up by his hair. Viran pleaded that he should not be treated this way, but Deus warned the other knights that if even one of them moved, he would leave their fate to their imagination. Having already become a Master Knight and the benefactor of the Macallions, Deus was a force no one present could hope to challenge. Deus struck Viran again, causing his body to bounce heavily off the ground as he spilled blood. Alan watched, realizing that the present-day Deus was something entirely different from the boy he remembered. Deus told Viran to be grateful he was in a situation where he couldn't be killed before dashing forward and slamming him into a tree. The knight's back struck the wood with a sickening thud, but Deus did not relent, delivering a barrage of attacks. Alan stood in shock, trying to process the fact that Deus had called him his benefactor. He had assumed that the grown man would not welcome someone he barely knew, especially since Alan had never received a single reply to his many letters. Now, seeing Deus's strength, Alan felt a wave of warmth, feeling as though every word he had sent while raising the boy had been received. He was proud to see how remarkably well the young man had grown, maturing into an exceptional and upright person. A masterpiece of an upbringing. As Alan leaned on Evan's shoulder, he whispered that this must be what it felt like to see a well-raised son. Evan asked Alan if he was aware that his son was currently beating someone senseless. Alan wiped his eyes, playfully claiming he couldn't hear the remark. He was too busy being touched by the deed, finding it unbearably sweet that Diaz would step forward to defend his father's honor in a foreign land. Eventually, the one-sided beating ended, leaving Veron nearly lifeless on the ground. As Diaz finally turned toward him, Alan felt a flicker of discomfort, suddenly remembering that in the game's original lore, Diaz was one of the 5 great sins. However, the tension evaporated when Diaz bowed in deep reverence and respect. He told Alan that he would escort him, a gesture that left all the surrounding knights in absolute silence and astonishment. The scene shifted to a desolate battlefield where a rod was planted firmly into the earth, marking a space decimated and littered with bodies. A knight held the rod, which bore a flag, and screamed that Kulkan the Great, one of the 8 chiefs, and his entire clan had been annihilated. This knight was Delman, the 3rd Sword of Caliburn, and the captain of the Crimson Flame Knight Order. He proclaimed a glorious victory for his order, causing his knights to echo the cry as they prepared to return to their forward base for maintenance. Delman reasoned that having secured the mission's objective, he could return to the base with his head held high. He felt a surge of annoyance as he thought of Deus, harboring a deep desire not to be outdone by someone who had just recently become a master knight. While Caliburn and the barbarians usually upheld wars of honor, Delman had deceived Kulkan. He had struck the chief when he emerged alone, dealing with him and his infiltration force before wiping out the entire clan. He understood that he needed a clear, undeniable result for this expedition, because Deus had previously taken out Kurga of the snowfields. Delman noted that Kulkan's corpse had disappeared during the chaos, surmising that the barbarians must have hidden it. He felt confident that even if the chief were still alive, the poison used during the fight would have finished him by now. He felt a sense of excitement at the prospect of reporting this achievement upon his return to Caliburn. However, the atmosphere suddenly changed as an ominous energy surged around the base. The moment they arrived, they discovered that their forward base had been destroyed. Looking into the ruins, they saw Kulkan standing in the center of the carnage, completely healed. As Kulkan turned and spoke Delman's name, his gaze was terrifying. Delman infused his fire aura and took a fighting stance, struggling to understand the aura radiating from a man who should have been dead. Kulkan asked why he had defiled a sacred duel staked on honor, his voice carrying the weight of the deity that now possessed him, causing Delman to question if the being before him was truly Kulkan. The deity ignored the question, demanding an answer for the desecration of the duel. Delman flinched before lashing out, asking how Kulkan dared to mention honor when the mistake was trusting a word like duel on a battlefield. Delman struck the ground with fire, but Kulkan dodged with ease, noting that Delman had climbed to a high caliber for a human. The possessed chief offered a final chance for a duel, but Delman chose instead to order all his knights to prepare for battle. Kulkan, annoyed by what he perceived as a mortal without honor, signaled with his hands that he would not grant these barbarians an honorable death. Suddenly, the corpses littering the ground began to move, rising up to fight their former allies while begging to be killed. Kulkan used the distraction to thrust forward, slicing off Delman's hand in an instant. As Delman screamed, Kulkan struck the ground, causing everyone nearby to recoil and fly into the air. He dashed upward, kicking the airborne bodies with such force that they splattered heavily before landing and piercing his hand directly through Delman's chest. Delman gasped in confusion, wondering what kind of monster he was facing before his body fell limp to the ground. The deity proclaimed that all savages denied their deaths were now welcome to the bloody Colosseum, turning the fallen into slaves. This entity, the god of all barbarians known as Ultulrus, told the remaining survivors that he wished to bestow honorable deaths upon them, provided they could prove they weren't savages through a duel. It was clear, however, that none would survive. Back in Caliburn, Diaz remained bowed before Alan, offering to guide him. The surrounding knights were stunned to see the swordless showing such reverence to a foreign count. In Caliburn, Diaz McCallion's reputation was legendary. He had faced no punishment for beating a prince who harassed his sister and was known to be polite only to the king. To see him bow to Alan was a shock that rippled through the onlookers. Alan followed him to a massive mansion, realizing just how successful Diaz had become. Inside the mansion, the silence felt suffocating, leading Alan to wonder if Diaz felt uncomfortable in his presence. Despite being touched by Deus's earlier defense of him, Alan decided to get straight to the point as a show of respect. Once they were in a private room, Alan mentioned that he had come with a request for money. Diaz looked at him in surprise, and Alan clarified that it was a request, not an order. Diaz paused, then asked to continue the conversation while seated. Alan was surprised when Diaz directed him to the highest seat, a position usually reserved for the host. While it made him slightly uneasy, Alan felt a sense of warmth, feeling as though he were being treated like a father. Alan explained that he had 2 requests, admitting they might be a burden. He asked if Diaz would accompany him on a journey to the north. Before he could even finish, Diaz agreed gladly, mentioning that he was already preparing for an expedition to that region. Alan felt a sense of luck at the quick response, but recognized that the second request would be far more difficult. He took a breath and asked if it would be possible to borrow the Ring of the Madman from Caliburn's treasury. One of Diaz's men returned to the forward base, reporting to the vice captain that he had successfully finished the escort mission. The vice captain allowed himself a moment of relief, reasoning that with the captain himself escorting the Count of Palateo, there was little cause for concern. Suddenly, Diaz's sister, Lady Shelley, walked into the room, noting that her brother must be hosting a very distinguished guest if he had taken on the escort duty personally. The vice captain laughed, recalling the moment Diaz had altered their entire schedule. He shared how Diaz had ordered a 2-week delay for their northern expedition, simply because his benefactor was arriving. The vice captain mentioned to Shelley that he had never seen Diaz wear such a soft expression before, officially confirming that Count Palateo of the Asteria Kingdom had arrived. Shelley was struck with surprise, recognizing the name of the man she also considered her savior. Back in the private quarters, the atmosphere remained heavy as Alan posed his difficult request, asking if he could borrow the Ring of the Madman from Caliburn's treasury. Alan knew this was an unreasonable demand that would place him in significant debt to the royal family, yet he fathomed that the ring was essential for the success of his plan. Before Diaz could respond, Evan walked in, apologizing for his lateness. Alan welcomed the interruption, sensing it was the perfect time to improve the mood with the gifts they had prepared. Following Alan's instructions, Evan presented a variety of gifts, including a popular shoestring tie that Alan had chosen after thorough consideration. Diaz looked at the presentation with a bland expression, offering a simple thank you. When Alan encouraged him to open them, Diaz looked away, mentioning that it would be discourteous to do so in company and that he would open them alone. Alan gathered that the gifts might have been a failure, wondering if the Master Knight simply found them trivial or was being overly formal out of respect. Alan attempted to smooth things over, stating that he was willing to compensate Diaz if the request for the ring caused him any disadvantage. To his shock, Diaz responded that he would bring the ring immediately. He reasoned that while it usually took a week of formalities, the most bothersome part would be dealing with the king. He nonchalantly suggested he might just have to take out 50 people to speed up the process. Alan stood dazed, trying to discern if Diaz was joking, only to realize the man looked entirely serious. He quickly told Diaz that such extreme measures weren't necessary, though he was touched by how far the knight was willing to go for him. As Alan left the office, Shelley came running down the hall, calling out for her brother. She spotted Evan first, and the two reconnected warmly, as they had known each other since the rescue. Alan watched them, recognizing her as the vibrant girl he had ordered Evan to save back in the game's timeline. He noted that, seeing her in person was a stark contrast to the brief glimpse of her death in the original story. Suddenly, Diaz pulled his sister away, sternly telling her that she should address Evan as Mr. rather than brother. Alan gathered that while Diaz cherished his sister deeply, his protective nature over his family was becoming a bit extreme. It was in this moment that the truth finally clicked for Alan. He realized the reason Diaz was so incredibly devoted to him was that he had saved Shelley's life. Alan scratched his head, finally understanding the depth of the gratitude the McCallion family felt toward him. Shelley walked up to Alan, confirming his identity as Count Palateo and thanking him for ordering Evan to save her. Alan responded that he only did what he had to, though he knew inwardly that if she had died, her brother would have become a mindless killing machine. Receiving her genuine gratitude felt surprisingly nice, causing Alan to smile. He stayed at the mansion for only a single day before Diaz returned with the Ring of the Madman. Evan arrived shortly after, shouting in a panic about the stir Diaz had caused at the palace. He explained that Diaz had made a massive fuss at the treasury, and when the second prince tried to nitpick his request, Diaz had simply slapped him a few times until the ring was handed over. With the artifact secured, they spent 3 days preparing before Alan joined the Solar Eclipse Knights on their northern expedition. 2 weeks later, the grim reality of the North set in. News poured into the forward outpost regarding the total annihilation of the eastern base. The news circulated that Delman, the third sword of Caliburn, had fallen at the hands of the possessed Kulkan. Inside the command tent, the atmosphere was thick with desperation. The nobles argued about retreating, noting that the first sword was in seclusion and the soldiers were too wounded to fight. Dias clapped his hands to draw their attention, leading to a discussion with Fiola, the fourth sword and captain of the Preservation Order. Fiola mentioned that the outer god was sweeping through their bases with an army of the undead. While Delman was dead, Kiriana, the second sword, had been severely wounded at the western base. Fiola looked toward the chilling landscape, sensing an ominous red mana visible only to those of a high caliber. He suggested that retreating might be their best option. Meanwhile, near a crackling fire, Alan and Evan were eating roasted sweet potatoes. Dias approached them, wondering where they had even found the food in such a desolate place. Their quiet moment was interrupted by a ruckus nearby. A group of men from the King's Grace Knight Order were harassing a lady, begging her for one more treatment. The woman, Phenia Chrisin, who was the vice master of the Blue Magic Tower and a high-ranking healer, flatly refused. She stated her treatment was done, and she was only there to investigate the barbarians' rituals. As she moved, she barked at Dias to get out of her way, but she suddenly froze. She recognized Alan standing by the fire, her eyes widening in confusion as she wondered why he was there. The moment Alan saw Phenia, he waved at her, noting that he had heard a rumor she was present and found it to be true. The Vice Tower Master, however, appeared visibly shaken by his sudden appearance, prompting her to explain that the medicine he had previously mentioned was currently out of stock. She added that preparing it would take considerable time and that she was currently spread thin with her duties. Alan responded with a soft touch, stating that he had truly hoped for her help, but understood if it was too much to ask. This humble response seemed to unnerve her even further, causing her to quickly clarify that she hadn't said she couldn't help him. Our boy sensed his opening and played it close to the vest, mentioning that his finances were a bit tight and payment might be slightly delayed. Phenia immediately insisted that a single gold coin would be more than enough. Watching this interaction, several nearby mages were so dumbfounded, wondering how their esteemed Vice Tower Master could be smiling, while essentially being tricked out of a potion worth hundreds of gold coins. Phenia dashed off with impressive speed, declaring she would prepare the potion immediately since it worked best when fresh. Alan simply chewed his sweet potato, having achieved what no one else could. The scene shifted as the atmosphere turned cold. Fiola sensed an ominous energy whooshing into the camp and stood up. Dias had already gripped his sword hilt, sensing the discomfort of an imminent attack. Outside, the transition was instantaneous, as undead bodies began to swarm the base. The knights charged, but the situation turned treacherous as their fallen comrades rose to join the enemy ranks. Suddenly, Phenia returned to the fray, using ice shard magic to freeze the undead before shattering them into thousands of pieces. Dias followed suit, whooshing through the crowd and slicing through the horde with lethal precision. Both Dias and Phenia looked upward, spotting a despair that can only be born from overwhelming power. The possessed body of Kulkan descended from the sky like a meteor. The entity within him, now clearly an outer god, commanded the humans not to defile those who had lost their honor. Fiola intercepted the god's path, striking him in the chest, but he deduced with horror that his blade could barely scratch the entity's skin. The outer god declared that those who abandoned the glory of their souls would be denied an honorable death, before striking Fiola across the face. In a terrifying instant, Fiola's life was extinguished, and he rose again as an undead slave. As the knights screamed for their fallen captain, our boy walked calmly into the clearing. Alan addressed the entity by its true name, Oltultus, the great god of duels. He invoked the Oath of Calgunia, offering himself in honor of the sacred vow and calling for the duel of Babylon. The deity laughed, finding it welcoming that a human still knew the ancient oaths. With a snap of its fingers, the outer god caused the energy from the surrounding undead to seep out and vanish, encircling himself and Alan in a barrier. Oltultus accepted the duel, welcoming Alan to the bloody Colosseum where no one could interfere. Alan's body shivered as he fathomed the sheer weight of the god's presence. He realized he had underestimated how close the entity was to a full manifestation. The closer an outer god is to incarnation, the more its power rivals the 5 great sins. He reasoned that if he hadn't just consumed Phenia's potion of excellence, the aura alone would have caused him to pass out. This was his only window to act. Alan declared the start of the duel, prompting the god to explain the first rule. The challenged party takes the first attack. Oltultus laughed, promising a melody of destruction as he prepared to strike. The spectators screamed for everyone to turn back, but our boy stood his ground, bound by the second rule. The defender cannot move at all during their opponent's turn. The outer god praised him as an honorable fool as the third rule was established. Each turn consists of one attack and one defense, with the parties switching roles at the end. Alan began making rapid hand signs and incantations, concluding that regular defense stood no chance against such power. He focused his speech magic on immobilization, condensation, and reinforcement, prepared to spend his entire magic quota to survive this single blow. The outer god struck with a force that caused a massive explosion, shattering the ground and sending a pillar of dust into the sky. When the haze settled, a massive crater remained. Fenia looked on in terror, fearing the worst, but Alan remained standing. Though bloodied and disheveled, a magic circle glowed around him, and the chain around his neck faded away. He recalled Fenia telling him about the remission potion, which could ease even the most intense pain. He realized the potency of her work was the only reason he was still upright. Alan poured a high-grade healing potion over his body, recovering his strength instantly. He looked toward Otultus and stated that all the conditions to enter the state of madness had been met. He called out a binding spell and positioned the ring of the madman he had acquired. With a determined glare, he told the deity that he was not going to let him go. As he called out the binding summon, a strange, ethereal figure manifested before him. Alan sensed the activation of the duel's constraints, concluding that within this sacred space, no defense or counterattack was permitted outside the established turns. While he had simply tanked the first hit in the game version of this event, he reasoned that things were different here. The reinforcement effects were no longer limited by a countdown, but by the weight of reality itself. Alan began to weave his magic, invoking the first constraint. Because he was currently on snowy terrain, he could twist the rules of the world just enough to tip the scales. As eyes from another realm began to peer down at him, Alan spoke the word diffraction, twitching his hand as lightning crackled into existence. He then invoked the second constraint, utilizing the fact that he stood at the gate of death to bend reality further. He called out Primordial Point, causing the lightning to surge from his palm directly toward the outer god. With a focused glare, our boy commanded condensation and extinction. The lightning fired, fueled by every drop of energy stored within Alan's bracelet. In that moment, the third constraint revealed itself. When fighting against a god, the rules of the world could be twisted even further. Alan called out Silent Front, causing the energy to expand so violently that the land erupted and shattered into fragments. Finally, Alan invoked the fourth constraint, stating that because he was using magic against Othultos, the great god of duels, he could bend the laws of the world one last time. Per the rules of the duel, the outer god was forbidden from moving, causing him to stand still as the massive explosion of energy struck him head-on. As the dust settled, Alan noted that, for this to truly work, the entity had to be wiped out in a single hit. However, an outer god does not simply vanish when its physical vessel is struck. The entity stood there with a massive hole blown through its heart, yet it continued to smile. Othultos admitted the strike was not bad, causing Alan to feel a surge of shock that his most powerful attack had failed to kill the god. He sensed that he had exhausted all the magic in his bracelet, and feared he had failed. However, the outer god began to laugh, asking if Alan was truly the heir to his will to be capable of such a feat. Suddenly, the god's vessel fell plump to the ground and began to wither. Othultos acknowledged that it had been an admirable duel, and called Alan a noble warrior. As he began to disperse, the god expressed curiosity about the future conflict between the Black Thing and the Blue Thing. Claiming a newfound affection for Alan, he granted him a gift and all its powers, throwing a belt toward him. Othultos commanded Alan to call upon his true name, the God of Chaos, when the usurpers eventually broke free from their chains. With those final words, the god vanished, leaving Alan victorious. A god's respect earned. After the troops finished burying the deceased and the area was at peace, the group returned to Kidrum. Inside the carriage, Alan sat with Fenia, who was visibly hoodwinked and terrified of him. When Alan asked if she considered him a rank 3 mage, she frantically agreed, clearly fearing his power. Alan then questioned her about the Blue Thing and the Black Thing, but she shook frantically, swearing she knew nothing. She was so desperate to escape his presence that she whooshed out of the carriage before Alan even dismissed her. Alan exhaled and laid back on the couch, feeling like a criminal because everyone was so terrified of him. He looked down at the Belt of the Forgotten he had received. He recognized it from the game as a reward for defeating Othultos, an item that doubled both damage dealt and damage taken. He noticed an inscription on the belt, leading him to believe that his next step should take him to Kahala, the city of ancient gods. 2 weeks later, back in Kidrum, Deus delivered his final report and returned the Ring of Radiance to the treasury. As Alan prepared to depart, he mentioned that the gifts he received from the king helped offset the fact that he had gone broke just to survive the expedition. Dias looked at him and asked if he could ever become as strong as Alan. It was an ironic question coming from the world's youngest Master Knight, but Alan assured him that with hard work, he could reach any level of strength he desired. Dias then asked why Alan always asked for favors instead of giving orders like others would. Alan responded that one does not give orders to members of their family. These words hit home, causing Dias to stand in shocked silence as he watched the carriage ride off. That evening, inside the McCallion mansion, Dias sat among the gifts Alan had given him. He felt a deep sense of belonging, realizing he was finally in a space where he was wanted. He tried to mimic Alan's hand signals, whispering the words, "Silent Front," but nothing happened. He smiled to himself, wishing he could use magic with the same grace as Alan, but more importantly, he cherished the realization that he was truly considered family. Returning to the Palateo mansion, Alan felt a surge of relief to finally be home after a grueling 3-month journey. However, the moment he stepped into his office, he was greeted by a mountain of documents that acted as a cold welcome into a den of overdue work. The sight was so overwhelming that he instinctively closed the door, briefly trying to convince himself he had walked into the wrong room before the reality of his responsibilities as an overworked noble set in. He realized that until he cleared this backlog, his dream of a peaceful life would remain out of reach. After finishing the tasks, Alan granted himself a week of rest. Yet, even in the middle of this supposed heaven, the instincts of a career employee haunted him, causing him to feel stressed by the very act of doing nothing. He spent his time pacing back and forth, his mind lingering on the mysteries Atholtos had left behind. He pondered the ritual gestures and the enigmatic god of chaos, wondering how a deity could possess a forgotten name similar to the Eastern gods. The fact that an outer god had appeared at all suggested that others might follow, though he reasoned that gods who gave warnings were far less problematic than the unpredictable 5 sins. During his research, Alan consulted his notes on the game's lore, ensuring he wouldn't forget any crucial details. He recognized the name Kahala, but understood that the city had not yet been discovered by explorers, making a visit there a logistical nightmare that would only complicate his current standing. His focus was interrupted when Evan walked into the office. Noting that the room felt strangely freezing, Alan hadn't even noticed the temperature drop, concluding that his magical research was finally yielding tangible results. Evan then delivered startling news, mentioning that a hidden city had recently been discovered in Colony. The scene shifted to Utaya, who was concluding a semi-annual Blue Moon meeting held via crystal ball. While these meetings usually lasted less than 10 minutes, the atmosphere changed when Solon mentioned hearing that the Great Moon Alan had visited Caliburn. She turned to Dias, asking what it was like to see him in person. The usually silent Dias became incredibly vocal. Dias began a long-winded narration, describing how Alan had stepped forward alone to challenge an outer god when everyone else was consumed by fear. He spoke for over 50 minutes, detailing how Alan had seemingly predicted the incident and prepared for the duel. Dias's relentless praise became so excessive that Solon eventually begged Utaya to end the call. Utaya, however, sat back and smiled, clearly enjoying the glowing report of our boy's exploits. The meeting, which typically ended in an instant, stretched on for over 3 hours, setting an absolute record for the Blue Moon sessions. Back at the Palateo residency, Alan found his halls filled with a staggering array of gifts. Evan explained that these were artifacts and treasures from the deep floors of the labyrinth, some valuable enough to purchase entire mansions. Alan read through the accompanying letters, realizing they were from nobles like Baron Farima, who hailed him as the savior of the Master Knight. The gifts continued to pour in for over a month, leading Alan to conclude that Dias was being a remarkably good son by boosting his reputation in Caliburn. He decided to let it slide that Dias had not contacted him directly in so long. As summer began and the influx of gifts slowed, Alan traveled to Teria, the capital of the Asteria Kingdom, for the Grand Assembly. Realizing he was running late for his very first assembly, he sprinted toward the hall, not wanting to draw unnecessary attention. Evan watched him dash by, surprised to see Alan moving with such urgency. Upon entering the assembly hall, Alan tried to navigate the complex social geography. He knew the royalists sat on the left and the aristocrats on the right, leading him to believe the center was neutral territory. Seeking to remain inconspicuous, he attempted to find a seat in the back, but he sensed every eye in the room fixed upon him. Feeling uncomfortable, he moved toward the middle row, yet the staring persisted. Eventually, he gradually walked all the way to the front row and sat down. He wondered if the front row was empty simply because no one wanted to sit near the faction leaders, unaware of the status his presence carried. The assembly began with an announcement that a new faction named Kalpa had received voting rights. Alan sat silently, hoping for a quick conclusion, only to be jolted when he was introduced as the president of Kalpa. He sat in stunned silence, wondering what Kalpa even was, and if he was the only person in the room left in the dark. He glanced behind him and spotted Loria Altia and Kalia Genonia sitting together. He recognized that the Genonia and Altia families had formed an alliance and founded this faction, but he found it hard to fathom why they had named him the head of it. When the assembly asked if the president of Kalpa had anything to say, Alan remained frozen. It was a strange situation. While he had no idea of the immense influence he now wielded, Laura and Kalia looked on with pride, clearly impressed by the organization they had built around him. The scene shifted back to the snowy mountains, where a solitary figure walked through the silent expanse where the fallen knights had been laid to rest. Arriving at the site of the clash between Alan and the outer god, the figure began to chuckle, whispering that the display was interesting while surveying the scarred landscape. He mused to himself about how far our boy would go before the scene cut away to the Grand Assembly, where Alan remained in a state of visible distress. As the representative asked if he had any words to share, Alan struggled to fathom the situation, reasoning that there was no way he could have become a mastermind faction leader overnight. He sat there looking distraught, wondering if his life had turned into the plot of a light novel, until the speaker concluded that he had nothing to say and proceeded with the assembly. Following the session, a banquet was held to celebrate the establishment of the Kalpa faction. Even amidst the festivities, Alan remained troubled. While others performed and hailed him as the protagonist of the night, he sat in a corner, gathering that he was likely nothing more than a figurehead. Loria and Kalia eventually walked up to him, with Kalia asking if the banquet was to his liking, and Loria mentioning that everything had turned out exactly as he wanted. Alan looked at Duchess Altia and Countess Genonia, both of whom had recently succeeded their houses, and tried to recall their past interactions. He realized he had only spoken to them briefly years ago, causing him to wonder if he possessed a split personality that had organized this alliance without his knowledge. Loria expressed her gratitude for him saving her life, a statement that left Alan confused. Through their conversation, he pieced together the information that the Kalpa faction had been born because he had supposedly ordered an alliance between them. He realized they had completely misinterpreted an apology letter he had sent previously. Where he had mentioned not getting along with many nobles, they had seen a directive to form a faction, and recognized that this misunderstanding could likely never be cleared up. Our boy deduced that after receiving so many gifts, it might be dangerous to tell them the truth now, especially given the terrible personalities of the Genonia family. Loria asked what he planned to do next. Alan, knowing nothing of politics and wanting to sound impressive before making an escape, stated that he would start by sweeping up the underworld. This left them surprised as he walked off, intending to vanish before they could ask questions. Later that evening, Alan boarded his carriage, telling Evan not to look back and to head for Colony immediately. Back at the banquet, Loria and Kalia discussed his sudden departure. They noted that since they already controlled the underworld in their respective areas, uniting the entire underworld under Alan's vision would be an interesting challenge. The legend grows on its own. As the carriage moved away, a mysterious figure hovered nearby. This assassin, an agent from a Federation Kingdom organization with Swordmaster-level skills, identified Alan as his target. He acknowledged that while killing Alan would be easy, the retaliation from the Master Knight would be annoying. However, he recalled his meeting in the southern Ashutalan Kingdom at Duke Kamalan's mansion. There, he had met with Carmine, the tyrant of Ashutalan, who had requested Alan's elimination. Carmine had offered 4 abyss entities as payment, items that grant special powers and trade at astronomical prices. The agent had accepted, eager to see how much stronger the entities would make him. Carmine had laughed, thinking that Alan would never live a peaceful life after crossing him. Meanwhile, the agent had also spoken with the Seeker, Duke Kamalan, the power behind the Federation's underworld. Though the Duke knew his son Carmine had stolen the abyss entities for the hit, he chose to turn a blind eye, telling the agent to do as he wished. Floating above the carriage, the agent prepared his strike, whispering that there were no hard feelings. Suddenly, an explosion rocked the ground as someone struck the agent from behind. The assassin fell, coughing and unable to move, as Alvin appeared above him. The child told him he was wasting his energy and, using magic to hurl him into the air, stated that if the target hadn't been the Count, the agent wouldn't have had to die. The mysterious child broke the agent's wand and vanished as Alan's carriage continued on, safe, and unaware. The journey toward their destination led them into the scorching expanse of chaleur écrasante. Inside the carriage, Evan complained that his lungs felt as though they were boiling, struggling to cope with the oppressive environment. Alan noted that despite traveling for 5 days, they had yet to grow accustomed to the relentless heat. Evan suggested that an ice crystal would make the situation more bearable, and then he tried to persuade Alan to practice his magic. Alan declined, though Evan remarked that practicing was surely better than ending up roasted like a barbecue. Despite the discomfort, Alan maintained that joining a caravan had been a wise decision, as they were entirely unfamiliar with the desert's geography. Alan cast a glance to his right, prompting the lady in the neighboring carriage to demand why he was staring. She accused him of spying on people with a glare that matched her sharp tongue. This was Luann Agulis, the daughter of the Red Magic Tower Master, and a rank 4 mage. When Alan denied the accusation, she slammed her book shut, dismissing his attitude as the kind of feigned ignorance she expected from those of the Blue Magic Tower. Alan wondered if he would ever find a moment of peace. Evan, meanwhile, pointed out that her carriage was adorned with numerous ice crystals, leading Alan to conclude that the Red Magic Tower Master was a menace, and that it was best to keep a distance from his daughter. The scene shifted abruptly to a ferocious skirmish where a group of men were being systematically cut down. Barbarians from the Bloody Sand Bandits had launched an ambush during a short break at an encampment. One bandit leader held Luann captive before she could even react. Mocking her status as the Tower Master's daughter, Luann was paralyzed by trauma, struggling to breathe as the threat loomed. Suddenly, the sweltering desert heat vanished, replaced by a flash freeze that caused the entire space to crystallize. This sudden chill allowed Luann to catch her breath just as Alan stepped into the clearing, glaring at the bandits. Luann was exceptionally sensitive to mana, and had previously deduced that Alan barely possessed enough energy to reach rank 2. She had despised him, believing he was merely taking credit for the Master Knight's deeds. However, she now realized he was performing combined incantations, a technique requiring at least rank 5 mastery to link 3 distinct elements. The bandit leader released Luann and dashed toward Alan, but our boy was ready. He did a swift chant with the word freeze, causing the bandit's entire body to turn into solid ice in a single second. With a hand sign and the command to demolish, the frozen bandit shattered into pieces. Alan reasoned that bandits usually scatter once their leader falls, so he offered the remaining thieves a single chance to get lost. They took it immediately, screaming and fleeing into the dunes. Luann remained behind, finally grasping that the rumors about Alan Palateo were true. Later that evening, the merchants and travelers rescued by Alan shared their wine and meat with him as a gesture of gratitude. Alan enjoyed the meal, concluding that his plan had worked perfectly and that reducing his magical constraint penalties during his vacation had been a successful endeavor. While Evan munched on meat in the background, Alan analyzed his snowy land spell. It was a complex weave of space, frost, and maintenance magic. By using the belt at his waist, he had successfully limited the heavy penalties usually associated with bending the rules of the world. He understood that while combining 3 incantations was taxing, the results were undeniable. Luann eventually approached Alan and bowed sincerely, apologizing for her previous behavior and asking if she could discuss magic with him. Alan, acting as a magnanimous person, accepted her apology despite her earlier hostility, a move that earned Evan's silent approval. The remainder of the journey to Cologne was filled with academic exchange. Upon arriving at Cologne, Luann thanked him for his teachings and asked if he would attend the upcoming magic conference. Alan noted he wasn't affiliated with any tower, and thus lacked an invitation. Luann suggested he join the Red Magic Tower, though Alan simply thanked her for the kindness as she walked off, promising to see him there. Alan knew he needed something from the conference tower, so the connection served him well. As Evan finished securing their luggage, a sudden explosion rocked the ground behind them. A figure landed heavily in the street, causing a massive disarray. A lady emerged from the dust, visibly enraged, and laying waste to the men surrounding her. Evan drew his sword to protect Alan, but the lady whooshed behind our boy and grabbed him with a wide smile. She greeted him as Godfather, and Alan recognized her as Solon. She was ecstatic to see him, claiming she had been looking forward to his arrival since receiving his letter. Evan stood frozen in confusion as the crowd whispered in awe. This was Solon, the Golden Flash, one of the 4 Baba Yagas of Cologne. The onlookers were dumbfounded to see the rabid tigress treating a man with such warmth. As Solon pulled Alan away toward her own direction, Alan allowed himself to be led, though he worriedly wondered if she had actually killed the men from earlier. Solon led Alan to a massive, imposing building that served as her guild's headquarters, explaining that only her kin resided within those walls. She waved for him to follow, leading the group inside a structure so astonishing that Evan could only look around in amazement. As they moved through the halls, the guild members hailed Solon, welcoming their leader home with deep respect. Solon turned to a man named Ralga, asking if anything had occurred during her absence. Ralga bowed, assuring her that nothing had happened, before turning his attention to Alan with a smile. He welcomed Alan as the honored guest Solon had been eagerly awaiting, noting that she had sat at the entrance of Colony every day, anticipating his arrival, causing Solon to look momentarily shy. Upon entering her office, Solon twirled across her desk to reach her chair before inviting Alan to sit. Alan observed that she managed her guild members with impressive efficiency, to which she replied that because they were family, she required no one else. She then turned the conversation toward personal ties, questioning Alan about his lack of a blood relation to Utaya. Alan realized that despite their limited conversations, he held a significant place in her heart. Deciding it was time to reciprocate her kindness, he signaled Evan, who promptly brought in a mountain of gifts. Solon's eyes lit up with excitement at the sight of the presents, causing her to weave around Alan in a joyous display of affection. She declared her intent to help him, citing him as her benefactor. Solon revealed a gauntlet on her hand, explaining that it allowed her tribe to gather together because of him. Alan recognized the artifact as the essence of the Golden Mane tribe. He felt a sense of warmth, concluding that he was quite skilled at raising kids, given how readily everyone moved to assist him. Solon then grabbed him, insisting he rest from his travels, and led him to his quarters. Later, they discussed the desert journey, with Evan noting that the heat and a recent bandit attack were major concerns for their return trip. When Solon heard about the Blood Sand Bandits, a mysterious smile played on her lips. The scene shifted to the hidden stronghold of the Blood Sand Bandits, which quickly became a site of absolute devastation as Solon arrived. She scourged the space, laying waste to every criminal in sight by throwing them around like paper. She eventually cornered a man who identified himself as Kalman's younger brother, claiming protection from the strongest Baba Yaga. Solon dismissed his threats, stating that he had made the mistake of touching her benefactor first. She unleashed her power, engulfing the space and annihilating the organization in a single night. The following day, Solon reported the successful annihilation to Alan in his room. Alan was stunned by the speed of the operation, wondering how she had wiped out hundreds of night-level fighters so quickly. Solon proudly demanded praise, tucking herself into his bed and leaning close. Alan placed his hand on her head and patted her, realizing that while the title of Baba Yaga was impressive, her strength surpassed his expectations. The narrative then moved to the Colosseum, a popular attraction at Colony's steep end where gladiators fought in blood and madness. A man named Kalman stood victorious in the center of the ring, surrounded by the lifeless bodies of knights he had ferociously defeated. The announcer proclaimed him the longest reigning Baba Yaga of Colony. Later, inside his private space, Kalman was visited by Ralga. They discussed the total destruction of the Blood Sand Bandits. Kalman laughed off the death of his brother, revealing that the man was merely a tool used to control the underworld. Kalman told Ralga that the tragedy served as a perfect excuse for revenge. He presented Ralga with a box from The Seeker, containing abyss entities that grant immense power. Kalman urged Ralga to use them to devour Colony's underworld, and even aim for the throne, eager to see how long Ralga would last in the experiment. 2 days later, under the guild's protection, Alan arrived at the ruins of the ancient city of Kahara. Upon arriving at a dark cave entrance, Alan thanked Solon and proceeded inside with Evan. A torch illuminated their path until they discovered the heart of the ancient city. A strange, disembodied voice echoed in Alan's head, addressing him as a mage and commanding him to come to the tower. Sensing the weight of the request, Alan told Evan to wait below and ascended alone. At the top, he was greeted by a voice that welcomed him for meeting the minimum requirements of entry. The figure revealed herself as a black-bodied creature with no skin. Alan moved to call out the name of Othultos, but stopped himself, stating instead that he came following the words of the Wicked One. The figure moved toward him, acknowledging that he knew her true name, and deciding it was worth taking a chance on him. However, she noted that he lacked the proper class, which she defined as the standard by which the world judges a person. She warned him that an outer god would soon descend and he must deal with it. The figure expressed interest in the fact that Alan possessed myth magic, which she deemed superior to the magic of others. She explained that magic is the law designated by the Archmage, consisting of a phrase, a principle, and a manifestation. She noted that after a phrase is recited, the magic must unfold according to a principle to be true. Realizing Alan had never heard of these principles, she smiled and moved closer, promising to teach him a single, proper magic to illustrate the concept. Outside the cave, the heavy forest hummed with oppressive heat as Solon waited for Alan. She began to wonder why her benefactor was so late, sensing that something might have gone wrong, but her thoughts were cut short as the desert wind shifted. Suddenly, a figure darted through the clearing with a predatory smile, causing Solon to hear the immediate, agonized screams of her men behind her. She spun around to find Kalman standing over the fallen, holding the severed head of one of her guild members. Solon screamed in rage, demanding how he could commit such an immoral act outside the Colosseum. Kalman merely laughed, explaining that since she had annihilated the Bloodsand bandits and his precious little brother, this was a matter of family revenge. Kalman dashed past Solon to strike at the rest of her guild, forcing her to intercept him in a blur of motion. She managed to dodge his initial punch, sparking a heavy brawl that tore through the clearing. While Solon fought with everything she had, she was suddenly blindsided as a massive sword pierced her stomach. The strike was so sudden she could barely register the pain. She looked back in shock to see Rauga holding the blade, realizing he had betrayed her. Solon, who possessed a deep attachment to her kin and viewed her guild as the family she had sought since leaving the orphanage, felt her heart break along with her body. She had spent her life trying to recreate the bond of the Golden Mane tribe, yet Rauga stood there smiling, telling her to quit the stupid family act. Kalman urged Rauga to stop lingering and finish her off, dashing back into the fray. Solon managed to retreat in the nick of time, though Kalman mocked her for running like a rat. He knew he had the advantage, having increased his power several times over by injecting an abyssal entity. Despite her injury, Solon held her ground in a blur of high-speed attacks, but Rauga remained a mischievous threat on the periphery. He swung his sword again, bidding his boss farewell, as Solon twirled her body upward to dodge. Rauga laughed, noting that he also held authority granted by the essence of the Golden Mane. Even with a hole in her belly and two powerful foes hunting her, Solon gave them a run for their money, causing Kalman to feel the pressure of her overwhelming strength. The Golden Flash doesn't go down easy. Just then, Alan and Evan walked out of the cave. Kalman noticed them immediately, deducing that this was Solon's benefactor. Reasoning that Alan would make a perfect hostage, Kalman pivoted to attack him. Meanwhile, Solon suddenly started to slow down and Rauga laughed at her, revealing that the blade he had used to stab Solon was coated in Kimonos' poison, which would stiffen her body within the hour. Rauga mocked her further, explaining that the tribe had only gathered to claim the authority of the essence she owned, not to play family. Solon gasped, clinging to the belief that the time they spent together was real. But Rauga called her a daydreamer. He summoned other tribe members who had also turned traitor, surrounding her like common bandits. As Rauga raised his sword to claim the essence, a massive explosion erupted behind him. In a swift second, Alan had annihilated Kalman, leaving a massive hole in the bandit leader's belly. Alan then dashed towards Solon and Rauga, radiating an intense energy that manifested as red and blue eyes hovering above him. Alan noted the wisps of black magic power, calculating that Kalman must have used an abyssal entity. Alan reached Solon and poured a high-tier healing potion over her wound, assuring her that she would be able to move soon. He sensed her despair and gently noted that the rest of her guild was still a happy place, implying the others remained loyal. Solon began to sob with relief before taking a defiant stance in front of Rauga. Alan asked if she could hold off the enemy while he completed a complex spell, and she agreed, declaring that her family was waiting for her. As Solon and Evan dashed forward to lay waste to the traitors, Alan began his incantation. He spoke the word frost, causing a freezing wind to encircle him. He followed with form, causing the ice to coagulate into a solid mass. He recalled the lessons from the ancient city, recognizing that while words alter laws, phrases are the keys to bringing those laws to life. For the first time, Alan used a full phrase, "Renown of a snowy mountain." A burst of icicles erupted, shaping into a massive form. He followed with the phrase, "Pen of the blind," transforming the ice into a gargantuan spear. Finally, he called out the true name of the spell forgotten by the world, Painted Hellbird of Ice Crystals. Utilizing the energy from his bracelet and the belt at his waist, Alan channeled the immense power into the ice form. The crystal bird took shape, ready to be launched at the traitors, a masterpiece of frozen destruction. After perfecting the ice spear, Alan launched the massive projectile, just as Solon and Rauga were locked in a fierce duel. The arrival of the spell brought immediate despair to the men following Rauga. The icicles tore through the space, annihilating the traitorous guild members in a flurry of frozen violence. The spear continued its path, striking Rauga square in the stomach and thrusting him backward through the clearing. Solon managed to dodge the collateral impact of the attack, which laid waste to the majority of her enemies. Evan watched in pure astonishment as the desert heat was replaced by a thick haze of ice, a feat accomplished in less than 10 seconds. Our boy just redrew the map. Despite being pinned by the ice, Rauga exhaled a final, desperate breath, reasoning that nothing else mattered but the death of his boss. In a strange burst of strength, he shattered the ice, enslaving him, and charged, screaming that he would kill Solon to gain control of the essence and start anew. Alan moved swiftly to intercept, but as he stepped into the path of the strike, Rauga's blade struck Alan's side, much to Solon's shock. Alan began to cough blood as Solon watched, her face contorting into an expression of pure rage. Her leg lashed out in a blur of speed, connecting with Rauga's face with such force that his head was entirely burst apart. As his lifeless body slumped to the ground, Solon immediately turned to Alan, asking if he was all right. Alan sat on the ground, struggling to catch his breath. He deduced that the injury itself was a mere graze, but the effort of exhausting his mana had caused internal damage. He realized that while his magic was powerful, the toll on his body was significant. As Evan helped him up, Alan reflected on Kalman's earlier words regarding how the Seeker viewed him as an eyesore. He found a strange relief in the battle's outcome, realizing that when facing an opponent who has absorbed an abyssal entity, a being on par with a god, the third restriction of his magic is lifted. This allows his magic to twist the laws of the world more freely, making him even stronger and enabling him to take down such foes with ease. Turning his attention to Solon, Alan knew he had to cheer her up to prevent her from wallowing in dark emotions and becoming a sin. Solon was on the verge of tears, asking why he hadn't dodged the attack and blaming herself for his injury. Alan pointed out that she had claimed she could block the enemy, to which she asked if he truly believed her. Alan privately reasoned that it was less about belief and more about his inability to dodge, but he told her he didn't need a reason to save his family. When Solon reminded him that her tribe was her family, Alan admitted he had made a mistake in his wording. Suddenly, Solon began to blush. She looked at her benefactor and declared that she wanted to become family with him. Alan felt a surge of warmth, likening the feeling to an adoptive father finally receiving recognition. However, Solon quickly clarified her intent, noting that since she was a golden mane and he was a human, they should get married. Both Alan and Evan were struck speechless by the sudden proposal. Alan wondered why she was bringing up marriage now, as her tail wiggled in anticipation of his answer. 5 days later, news of Kalman's atrocities spread through Koloni, leading the public to despise the former Baba Yaga while Solon gained the support necessary to take his place. Her resolve to marry Alan did not waver. She sat in his carriage, continuing her persuasion. Alan reminded her for the 19th time that he viewed her as family, not a wife. Solon complained, arguing that marriage would make them real family and promising to make him happy. Alan simply thought that he would be happy enough with sweet potatoes and a laid-back noble life. Our boy has his priorities straight. When they arrived at her base, Solon stepped down from the carriage, telling Alan he had better give her a different answer next time. Alan waved her off, hoping she would eventually give up. As the carriage drove away, Solon stood alone, realizing that simply gathering her tribe wasn't enough to find happiness. Her experience with Rauga's betrayal taught her that she had to be more careful about whom she called family. She determined that she must become a god capable of protecting her benefactor, the one person she knew she could count on forever. Back in the carriage, Evan reported that the Information Guild found no other suspicious individuals following the purge of Rauga's men. Alan felt a sense of pride in having raised Solon so well, though he remained troubled by the command he had received at the ruins to take care of the coming outer god. He recalled the voice's final instructions to search the far east end of the Kahara stronghold. There, he found a tombstone that he strangely understood. It spoke of those who value honor, those who search for forgotten death, and those who delve into the mysteries of magic. He recognized the metaphorical references to the Great Five Sins, but he was confused by the terminology. In the present world, the goddess of psychedelia events are in the future, yet this ancient stone recorded the 5 great sins as outer gods. The discrepancy weighed heavily on his mind. Evan interrupted his thoughts with more news of the children Alan had influenced. Dias had defeated the first sword, Reinhardt, after only half a year of training. Furthermore, Renee had secured a position of authority in the 3 councils of Larthania, and Radon had united the 5 archipelagos to become the Pirate King, sporting a bounty in the millions. Alan found the news of Radon's career as a Pirate King particularly distressing. The scene shifted to Solon using a communication orb to speak with Uttaya and the others. She confidently declared her intent to marry the Great Moon, causing an immediate and uncomfortable tension. The others realized that such words would undoubtedly provoke Uttaya's wrath, potentially sparking a war if Solon didn't choose her words more carefully. Thanks for watching, guys. When I was reading this one thing I found really crazy about Alan is how much influence he has and how his own influence shocks him every time. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I'm excited for what I have for you guys next week, but I appreciate you guys for watching, and hopefully, I'll see you on the next one.